and they create all kinds of havoc: heart disease, autoimmune disease. They're called chip cells or zombie cells. And they cause immunosenescence, which means the aging of the immune system.
White rice could actually be helpful, which is, again, that's very counterculture.
There's, I think, 180, 200 or so known autoimmune diseases. Then there's things like lupus that actually can affect your entire body.
And the data on this is just extraordinary. David Ludwig and others have shown over and over again that all calories are not the same through randomized controlled trials, showing very profoundly different effects on metabolism. For example, by just changing the macronutrient composition. Forget all the phytochemicals, right? Just changing protein, fat, and carbs. If you have a very low carb diet versus a low fat diet, if they're identical calories in a group of insulin resistant patients, in a randomized control study where they were given the food, there was no question about their eating, the overweight insulin resistant group that was eating the low carb diet burned 400 calories more a day. In other words, their metabolism was sped up when they cut out the sugar and starch and ate the fat. So that's just one example, but there's so many that has to do with all the other things in food besides just calories.
Also, the low carb group, correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't there data that suggests that even when on an isocaloric diet, they'll require less medication because they have less, they have fewer glycemic excursions, right? When they're eating fewer carbohydrates.
Yeah, of course. I mean, their blood sugar is better, their cholesterol is better. It increases muscle mass, decreases visceral or belly fat. The data is pretty compelling. But again, that's just macronutrients. Forget about that. And think about the 25,000 molecules in food that are phytochemicals that come from plants and actually now are found in meat that eat plants. From data from Fred Provenza and Stephen Van Vliet at Duke, it's pretty compelling when you get wild animals or when you have grass finished beef that's eating a wide variety, not just like one grass and one pasture, but a wide variety of plants. They actually increase the levels of these beneficial phytochemicals in the meat. And it can be as equivalent in dosage as much as vegetables, which is pretty amazing. So we have all these compounds, and those are regulating every function all the time. Like, for example, broccoli has glucosinolates, which I'm picking on broccoli today, but or sulforaphanes, which are these phytochemicals that aren't vitamins and minerals, not protein, fat, fiber, carbohydrates. They're these molecules that regulate, for example, detoxification. So how do you get rid of environmental chemicals and metals and pesticides? How do you get rid of your own internal toxins? Well, you need certain amounts of these compounds that can be anti-cancer. And that's why they find, for example, that people who eat a lot of these cruciferous vegetables, when they look at high levels of these compounds in their urine, they did studies in China, they find that those who have highest levels of basically broccoli in their pee have far less cancer, right? Because it detoxifies all these toxins. That's just one example. And I could speak for hours on each of the different examples. And they're in the book, whether it's Himalayan tartary buckwheat and the 132 phytochemicals in there that rejuvenate your immune system, whether it's the polyphenols in green tea, pomegranate, and cranberry that fertilize a particular bug in your gut called Akkermansia that's needed to improve your metabolism, reduce inflammation, deal with autoimmune disease, even actually can help you treat cancer. It's like, wow, all of a sudden you've got a whole different palette of things to work with to upgrade your health and to improve your overall well-being.
There's this pushback on social media to the notion of detoxification diets. And I think rightfully so to some degree, right? Because there's a lot of there are many supplements and juice cleanses and things that are sold under the guise of detoxifying your body. And so there's this pushback to it, but I think it's so important for people to understand that food really can help you detoxify, like that broccoli sprout study you were talking about. Help people in China get, better, more effectively excrete benzene, carcinogens like benzene, acrolein.
Right. Yeah.
This is all so important. What are some of your other favorite phytonutrients to talk about?
Well, I love phytochemicals. Phytonutrients. And the one that I'm really learning a lot about now are the ones in this Himalayan tartary buckwheat, which our friend Jeff Bland has kind of rediscovered, this ancient grain that's 3,500 years old that is grown in Himalayas, full of so many powerful compounds because it's grown under duress. It's grown in harsh conditions, in cold weather, in poor soil, in high altitudes, in poor water conditions, and drought. And yet it produces this incredible grain, or it's actually a flour, not the kind of F-L-O-U-R, it's F-L-O-W-E-R. and it's it turns out that just as an example of one of the things it does is it helps to rejuvenate your immune system. And what do I mean by that? Well, as you age and as you get insulted by life and chemicals and toxins and radiation, who knows what else, EMS, your stem cells in your bone marrow can get injured that make white blood cells. And you make 1 million white blood cells every second. Like every second, you make 1 million white blood cells.
Wow.
Okay. And those stem cells kind of write the program for those white blood cells. But if the stem cells are funky, you get funky white blood cells. And then those get in your blood and they circulate around and they create all kinds of havoc, heart disease, autoimmune disease. They're called chip cells or zombie cells. And they cause immunosenescence, which means the aging of the immune system. Well, it turns out that these compounds in Himalayan tartary buckwheat, and some of them are really only found in this one plant, are immunorejuvenating and are one of the few things that will actually kill the zombie cells.
Wow.
So that's amazing. Just to me alone, if I want to, so I'm making pancakes from it. We made soba noodles from it, and it's way higher in protein, very low glycemic load, super high in vitamins and minerals, and really rich in these phytochemicals. It's, I think, the most phytochemical rich plant on the planet, because of the way it's grown, and it's stressed by the stress of its environment. It's had to produce all these defenses, which are these phytochemicals. I mean, they weren't put in the plants for us. They were put in the plants for the plants to use to defend themselves or attract, pollinators or whatever they do, plants do, in their own intelligence. And we have borrowed that. That biochemistry to upregulate our biology. So we're lazy. Like, we don't make vitamin C. We have to get it from food. We don't make omega-3 fats. Other animals can make vitamin C, for example. But we sort of are lazy. And if we can grow up in an environment where we got to use all these plants, then we actually can use them for biology. And I call this symbiotic phytoadaptation, meaning that we've evolved symbiotically with plants to borrow their biochemistry to help regulate our biochemistry and use them when we need to. And they're not, quote, vitamins and minerals in the sense that they're not essential nutrients, but I think they're conditionally essential, because if you don't have them over your long life, your health will be poor and you'll be not as vibrant and healthy as you could be, or you might even get really sick.
Symbiotic phytoadaptation.
I know, I made that up. I made that up. Isn't that good?
I'm gonna start using that. What a beautiful, elegant way. What a beautiful, elegant way to describe the phenomena whereby a plant with more vigor in it, right? Like a survivor of a plant, actually lends its vigor to you, right?
Right.
That's incredible.
Yeah. And what's interesting is, when you start to look at plants these days, they're not like the plants we used to eat. The soil is low in organic matter because of tillage and chemical use. We basically killed the microbiome of the soil, which is required to extract the nutrients for the plants. So our broccoli and our vegetables are 50% less nutritious than they were 50 years ago. And on top of that, because of increasing carbon in the atmosphere, plants eat what? They eat carbon. They eat carbon dioxide. They breathe carbon dioxide. So carbon is the root of carbohydrates, right? And so they put the carbohydrates in the soil, which is good. That's the organic matter. But because of this increased carbon, what we're seeing is plants are far less nutritious because they're increasing their carbohydrate content, and their protein and nutrient content is going down. So based on looking at kind of current trends with climate change, 122 million people, just because of this increase in climate change, will be protein deficient. 1 billion people will be iron deficient. There'll be, I think, 75 million who will be zinc deficient. So we're in a situation where the way we're growing food is also the problem. And when you mentioned the plants under duress, organic is more, stressed, for example, than a conventional crop. And a wild crop is more, a wild plant is more stressed than an organic plant, right? And a regenerative is probably somewhere in the middle there. But you look at for example, a strawberry. If you ever eat a wild strawberry, it's about this big. You can barely see it, but it's like the biggest explosion of flavor you could ever imagine. That's because of all the phytochemicals, and there's phenysteine and other compounds in there that are super helpful for aging and all kinds of health benefits. Whereas if you eat a conventionally grown strawberry, it's full of pesticides. It tastes like cardboard and has almost no phytochemicals, right?
Yeah, I've started eating strawberry leaves. Like, I just pop the whole thing in my mouth. Strawberry leaves are a significant source of caffeic acid, which
there you go.
is a powerful antioxidant. Yeah. That's, super interesting. So on the spectrum of, a more plant-based diet, and then we have obviously now a growing population of people on a carnivore diet who are only eating meat. Where do you stand between those two poles? I mean, what does your plate look like when you're sitting down for dinner?
Well, last night was a really good example. I'm on Maui, and there's often more deer than there are people because they were introduced by some invader years ago, and it was a bow cod deer on land next to a friend of mine. A little bit of venison, probably 4 ounces, 6 ounces, and I had Japanese sweet potato. I had oleo mushrooms, which are the incredible mushrooms with tomato sauce. And we had a big salad with watercress and radishes and avocados and a miso tahini dressing. And I was so most of my plate was like the vegetables, the tiny side of, and of course there's sometimes a little chocolate for dessert. But essentially, I think the whole conversation about meat is very confused and very confusing. And I've discussed this many times, and there are just such polar opposite camps. And so part of the whole purpose of the book was say, look, you don't want to let your ideology trample over your biology, right? You basically, if you have a belief, for example, that you should be vegan and you end up doing it and you feel like crap, and you lose your period and your sex drive and your muscle mass, and you become nutrition deficient, depressed, and low energy, and don't have oomph, then maybe you should listen. I was with a woman the other day who was an Olympic athlete, and she's like, she went vegan, and she's like, she just lost her power. And I talked to another elite athlete who was a tennis player, who's top 1-2 tennis players in the world, and he was like, yeah, I want to be vegan, but I can't, like, if I want to hit the ball. So I think there's a point of view of looking at what works for you based on a personalization of nutrition, which is where we're headed, and two, what makes sense scientifically based on the data we have. And I think when you look at the meat data, there's over 100,000 studies on meat, and you can find anything in there you want to read. And I got my little nutrition news. You might get that as like a little science journal, which you get like, what are the latest studies that come out? So you always kind of keep up to date, and it comes in your email box. And I just love the study, because it was like, it was so funny, because it was on the same day. It basically said, let's see if I can find this one. Study strengthens links between red meat and heart disease. The next study down was Mediterranean diet with beef may lower risk factors for heart disease. So no wonder people are confused. The first study was a study that showed in a population, an observational study, that people who ate meat had more heart disease and heart function. And this is a study that does not prove cause and effect, but basically shows an association. And it turns out that meat has been vilified. And so anybody who's eating meat probably is somebody who's not focused on their health, someone who isn't as committed to a healthy lifestyle, let's say. And when you look at the data, when you look at the characteristics of the meat eaters in these studies, they're more overweight. They tend to eat more calories. They smoke more, drink more, eat less fruits and vegetables, don't take their vitamins, eat more processed food, sugar, and starch. Of course, they have more disease. Is it the meat, or is it the rest of their lifestyle? When you look at studies that have meat eaters and vegetarians who shop at health food stores, and you look at their risks, their risk of death goes down in half for both groups, because not what they're eating, it's what they're eating with it, right? So if you're eating meat in the context of a standard American diet, yeah. If you're eating meat in the context of a whole foods, plant-rich diet with tons of phytochemicals and spices, then no. And the other study was a randomized controlled trial, which is a more intentional study looking at cause and effect, and really measuring in each individual what's going on, not just sort of looking at big populations. And they found that actually, when you ate meat, your risk factors for heart disease went down, like LDL cholesterol. And people go, well, I thought meat's bad for your cholesterol. Well, that was the thinking, because meat contains saturated fat, and saturated fat raises LDL. And so that's what's bad. Turns out that the stearic acid in meat, which is the predominant saturated fat, doesn't really raise your blood cholesterol, whereas sugar and starch actually do. So sugar and starch are really the drivers of most of lipid issues in this country, which are small particles, lots of particles, high triglycerides, low HDL. That's what we call atherogenic dyslipidemia. And in English, that means it's the kind of cholesterol profile that causes heart attacks. And that comes from sugar and starch, not from eating meat or fat.
Yeah. I mean, I do think it's, Yeah, keep going. Sorry.
No, so the TMAO issue is interesting. People say, what about TMAO? Well, two things. One, the carnitine and stuff that they gave was a supplement, not necessarily from meat. So we don't know how that works. And also they looked at, well, although some were from meat, but also they looked at, other factors that are, I was talking to Stan Hazen, who's done a lot of this pioneering research. He said, yeah, if you have red wine and olive oil and balsamic vinegar with it, it mitigates the effects. I'm like, oh, so, and in the book, I talk about how, for example, in Morocco and then the Maasai, they have no real increased risk of heart disease and cancer and things we associate with meat. And so neither do the Moroccans, even though they eat a lot of meat. And the Maasai, all they eat is meat and milk. But the difference is in Maasai, they put in 12 spices in their milk, and I think about 20 something spices in their meat. And same thing in Morocco, it's used with tons of spices. So the spices are these phytochemicals that are anti-inflammatory, antioxidant, change the ways in which these interact with your body in terms of the meat. So there's a lot of interesting sort of nuances around meat. And I think, we can talk more about it, but essentially, the three issues get conflated, which is, moral and ethical, environmental, climate, and health, right? And they're like, oh, if it's bad for one, it's bad for all. Well, it's not necessarily true. So moral and ethical, I kind of understand that if I have monks or I've taken care of very high lamas in the Buddhist world and they don't want to eat meat. I'm like, okay, well, we'll figure out a really diet that has all the right components in it to help you thrive with adequate protein and low starch and sugar. And a lot of these monks are all diabetic. A lot of these guys are all diabetic. And second is the fact that, if you think you're not harming animals by eating vegetables, you're not completely, getting the full story. And right. Here's why. When you actually do agriculture, it's a destructive act. So if you're growing a cabbage patch and you're destroying the habitat of all sorts of animals, and then you go in and mow it down and collect whatever, you're going to kill the rabbits or the moles or the mice or the birds. And the question is, well, is a rabbit's life any less valuable than a cow's life or a chicken's life? I don't know. But I mean, we're killing 7 billion animals a year just from vegetable agriculture. So you can't get out of that. And also, people are having organic vegetables. Well, how do they grow the organic vegetables? They use cow manure and bone meal and oyster shells and animal products to grow the vegetables. So your grass-fed beef is a vegan, whereas your broccoli is a carnivore. So, and then lastly is health. And I think that's sort of what we were speaking to earlier, which is the idea that, and the climate issues and the environmental issues. I think for sure factory farming and traditional agriculture is a disaster and should be banned. And it has for all sorts of reasons, climate, environment, inhumane treatment of animals, less poor quality product, et cetera, that's not good for human health. That should just be banned. But that's not to say that regeneratively raised beef is bad. And it turns out that you need animals to regenerate soil, which is critical for climate change. And I was just speaking to some woman who was a billionaire lady whose entire focus is a very smart woman who's very focused on solving climate change. And she said she looked with all her resources and all her scientists and all the data and everything, she looked around and wanted to come up with some cool solution and realized that it was dirt. It was soil. It was turning dirt to soil. And that is the number one solution for climate change. And literally investing tons of money and doing the research on this and looking further at it. And it just sort of struck me that, people just don't understand how important it is. And the only way to really build soil is to include animals as part of an ecosystem on the farm. And that doesn't mean you have to eat them. It doesn't mean you have to eat a lot of them. It just means that they have to be in there to build soil through peeing, pooping, digging around, and so forth. And lastly, the health issue, to talk about is so important, because if you're eating grass-finished, regeneratively raised meat with tons of phytochemicals, well, that's very different than eating a feedlot cow. Yeah. And there's even been randomized trials looking at, for example, wild kangaroo meat versus feedlot meat and its effect on biology. And even though it's the same gram for gram protein, when they feed them the kangaroo meat, levels of inflammatory markers go down. When they feed the feedlot beef, the inflammatory markers go up. So beef is not beef. So I think it's as Russ Conzer says, who's an organic farmer, regenerative farmer, says, it's not the cow, it's the how across the board on all of these things.
Yeah, I mean, some of the vegan talking points I think would be aligned with the notion that you know, a modern cow, a cow that goes through the feedlot system, right? It's like fattier than wild animals, right? Like we've never, you know, throughout our evolution, we probably never consumed animals as fatty as a modern cow. And that's why when you feed a cow what it naturally wants to consume, there's actually it's a less fatty animal, right? There's less saturated fat and things like that. In the kangaroo study, I haven't seen that, but I'm sure kangaroos are incredibly lean animals. So
yeah, and the venison I had last night had like not 1 ounce of fat in it. It was just solid, clean protein. Yeah.
So do you think that maybe there's a rationale then to be more cognizant of the fattiness of the animal that you're consuming? You know, like maybe opt for, because the dietary dogma over the past couple of decades is like lean protein, right?
Right.
So I'm just trying to like play devil's advocate even to my own diet and views on this. Is there a rationale to maybe reach for leaner meat as compared to fattier meat these days?
Well, that is a great question. And the answer is it depends. And, you know, I have the privilege of not just sort of learning about the science and reading and studying, but I have the privilege of having seen tens of thousands of patients over 40 years, almost 35 plus years of practice. And it's humbling because you will put one person on a high saturated fat diet and everything will look fantastic. Like on other people, it's a disaster. So I remember this one woman, she was overweight, she had prediabetes, cholesterol was super high, triglycerides really high, really low HDL. I'm like, look, she was stuck. I said, why don't you try a keto diet? So she was eating 70% fat and mostly butter and coconut oil as the fat. And I was like, okay, let's try this and see what happens for 6 weeks, 2 months. You know, it's not going to kill you, and let's try it. Turned out her cholesterol dropped 100 points. Her triglycerides dropped 200 points. Her HDL went up 40 points. She lost 20 pounds. All her inflammation went away, and she felt fantastic. I had another guy who was a mid-50s bike racer, great shape, but wanted to try it for performance. And I said, all right, so let's just make sure we check your numbers. It was a disaster. His cholesterol went crazy. His total particle number went up. His lipid particle size went down. It was just like the weirdest thing. So I think it really depends on the individual. So I would say there is no one straight answer, and everybody's looking for the answer. And that's really why the principles of the vegan diet are: one, food is medicine, and two, personalization. And there's 21 principles in the book that are not meant to be dogma, but they're meant to be guidelines for how to think about what to eat in each category of food and how to eat for different causes, right? For personalization, for mood, for gut, for longevity, you know, how to eat in an affordable way. And as well as, you know, what should you think about meat and which vegetables should you eat and what oil should you have and why? And how do you pick quality in each of the areas of the food you're eating? How do you pick the best medicines in everything? And that's really the whole purpose of the book. And if you follow it, you don't have to be perfect. And it's meant to be inclusive, right? And we know, look, we know all the people in the wellness field. We are, in the field, and we know we're not perfect, right? I mean, the other night I went and had vegan macadamia nut ice cream. It was really, really good. And it was a ton of sugar.
Makes you happy.
It was a ton of sugar, but you know what? I rode my bike, 30 miles and played tennis and did my workout. And so I'm like, okay, fine. But I just think we have to sort of understand that we need to get away from all these diet wars and conflicts, because all the different camps, right, are in the wellness world are all trying to do the same thing. They're all trying to get people to focus on improving the quality of their health. What the enemy really is the food system and the industrial processed food that most Americans are eating. It's not, whether you should have, 60 or 70 or 30% of your plate being this or that or the other thing. It's really about quality.
I couldn't agree more. And there's research that shows us that by increasing the quality of your food, it actually dictates the quantity of food that you end up consuming, right? That Kevin Hall study that came out 2018.
Yeah. I mean, literally they ate 500 calories more a day if they were allowed to eat junk food than if they ate regular food, right? And calories matter. I'm not saying calories don't matter, but it's like in the context of everything, it's like what calories and what are they doing to you? David literally just came out with a study a couple of weeks ago showing that in profound ways that the food impact on the reward centers in the brain and how very high carbohydrate and starchy foods are highly biologically addictive and drive cravings and addiction and increased consumption, slow metabolism, cause muscle loss, inflammation, decreased testosterone, cause cortisol, adrenaline. I mean, it's a mess when you eat that way. And so, yeah, I could eat carbs and sugar all day long. Like I would love to eat pasta and bread and potatoes and rice and ice cream. And yeah, I would really love that stuff. I don't do it. And sometimes I do, sometimes I will have a vegan ice cream, or sometimes I will have a little bit of rice, or I'll have whatever. But I think it's really about understanding how it plays out in the context of your overall diet and lifestyle.
Yeah. I mean, I think the mistake that most people in the fitness community make, is that they promote energy balance as a weight loss strategy. And it's not. It's like a science, perhaps we can call it a scientific truth, right? But it's not a strategy for people, especially people that are tasked with navigating the modern food environment, which at every opportunity is trying to sell you ultra processed foods that are simply not designed to be consumed in moderation. And so by trying to just eat smaller portions of pizza, pasta, burritos, frozen chicken dinners, and things like that, you're setting yourself up for failure. You're setting yourself up for chronic hunger. And that's why I think we see that diets tend to be unsustainable, right? You can't think of this as being a temporary fix, a quick fix. It's not a diet. It should be a lifestyle for you.
Yeah.
It should be a way in which you style your life.
Exactly. But, the thing is, when you focus on what you eat, you don't have to worry about how much, like I said. And what's fascinating is if you're off by 100 calories a day, and by the way, I challenge anybody to count their calories and then estimate what they're doing, and then literally make sure you measure everything, because you will be off. Even PhD nutritionists can't do this, right? They can't. You cannot get within 100 calories of what you're consuming. And if you're off 100 calories a day over the course of your lifetime, over 30 years, you're going to probably gain 20 or 30 pounds if you're off just 100 calories a day. Now, I'm 61, and I'm the same weight as I was when I was 21. More or less, although I have a lot more muscle now. I don't think about calories. And when you eat the right foods, your biology just normally will kind of adapt to doing the right thing. You don't have to. It's so smart if you just feed it the right food and get rid of all the junk and eat quality stuff. Your body knows what to do. It'll tend to reset everything in the right way, and then you'll naturally regulate what you're doing.
Yeah, 100%. How do we increase food access? Access.
Oh, wait, I want to say one more thing about this before
Please.
we talk about access to quality food. So, what's really fascinating to me is this book I've been reading called Nourishment by Fred Provenza, who's a rangeland scientist. He's a genius. This he's kind of like a guru, rancher, agroecologist. I don't even know what he is, but he's studied basically the relationship between humans, plants, animals, and nature, and this whole dynamic. And what he says is that if you look at animals and how they eat, if they're left to their own devices in a natural environment, like a grass-fed cow who's on lots of land with like Gabe Brown has 100 different species of grasses right on his land, they will deliberately seek out different plants for the flavor profile, but they're also, by the way, getting all these phytochemicals in these plants. So they're actually seeking out what they get their main nutrition, but then they're looking at eat all this for this vitamin and eat all this for this phytochemical. And they're not thinking that, obviously, but they're naturally seeking out things that are going to help regulate and improve the quality of their health. What's happened to us humans is we've gotten so divorced from understanding what our bodies want and need, and our whole craving, taste, flavor mechanism has been so warped by the industrial food system that we actually don't know what's good for us anymore, that we won't seek out the things that are good for us. And that people who, like in that study, are eating way more of the processed foods are doing it often in search of nutrients, right? If you look at kids who are iron deficient, what do? They eat dirt to get iron. It's called pica. Well, most people who are overweight are highly malnourished. We think, oh, you're fat, you're overnourished. No, you're actually undernourished with a lot of the most important vitamins and minerals. And so the body has this natural intelligence to try to seek out and eat more. And that's why you keep eating and eating and eating. So that I just had to sort of drop that in there.
Yeah, that's where I think you have to talk about protein as one of the most effective weight loss and body recomposition tools that exists, right? I'm sure you're familiar with the protein leverage hypothesis, that we leverage our food environment to ingest our the required amount of amino acids. And protein is, there's been a number of feeding studies, right, that have shown meta-analyses that show again and again, both in the short term and the long term, protein is the most satiating of the macronutrients. So that's why I tend to, at least in my own diet, I tend to focus on protein. I tend to prioritize protein and then kind of fill in the gaps around that for variety, for taste and stuff, you know, and when I'm filling out those gaps, that's when I will, bring in fiber into the equation, because fiber is satiating, but for another reason. Fiber is satiating because it mechanically, it takes in water, it stretches out the stomach, shuts off those hunger hormones like ghrelin. But what are your thoughts on protein? Is that something that you suggest being cognizant of, or it's more of a whole food?
Well, it's interesting. Most of the people in the diet world are focused on fat or carbohydrate, right? And certain proteins sort of ignored. Unless you're, in the medical world, then you do these protein-sparing modified fasts, which essentially you give people tons of protein in order to lose weight as a rapid weight loss strategy. So you give them protein shakes. And I agree, protein is very satiating. I think, the way I think about it is that you want enough, but you don't need a ton. For most people, it's really depending on your size, your weight, your activity level. But the guidelines are really 0.8 to 1.2, or maybe up to even 2 grams of protein per kilo, depending on your activity level. And so I think as an individual needs, and as you get older, you need more. And then the quality of the protein matters, right? So plant protein is okay, but it's not as good as animal protein in triggering muscle synthesis. So you need a lot more plant protein. And when you see these vegans who are super jacked, and you go, wow, how do you get like that? Well, they're pounding the plant protein powders. They're pounding those powders in order to get adequate levels. And there's even some, for example, like I just picked up one the other day, there was a sport protein that was a plant protein. And when I looked at it, it was basically, they just jacked up the protein amount and they jacked up the amino acids that are missing in plant proteins, or that are low in plant proteins, the branched chain amino acids that you need to build muscle. So you can do it on a plant-based diet, but I think it's really tough.
What in each area might be tweaked so that we might feel better and have better health, both in the short term as well as in the long term?
So how do you go about researching something like this? I know, your first book, the Genius Foods, is done very well. And so where do you go from there? You obviously said it's probably more than food.
Yeah. Yeah, well said. I mean, I think food is a huge part of the equation, and it's something that people feel very emotionally invested in, because our diets in a way become a part of our identity. It's very funny, actually, when you look at people's social media profiles. They're very often inclined to put their diets in their bios, in their social media profiles. Why do people do that? Because we tend to feel so strongly about our diets, because everybody eats, right? And what we eat is so ingrained in our sense of self. And once we have that diet, when we find a diet that works for us, what do we want to do? Well, we want to evangelize it. We want to become proselytists for our diet. So that's why I think diet gets most of the attention. But actually, diet is just one part of the pie. There are so many other aspects of the way that we live that are important when it comes to feeling good, having lots of energy, having a brain that works as well as it ought to, not just as well as we've accepted it to. And of course, procuring our long-term health. And so every topic that I cover in my book, The Genius Life, is certainly deserving of its own book. So I tried to basically look at all of the breadth of research that's out there in regard to nature immersion. So our relationship with the outdoors, with the external world, our relationship with light, our relationship with time. So many of these aspects have basically become deranged and decoupled from our biology. And so that's really where I began. I began with nutrition, because I've had a sort of lifelong passion for nutrition, and that's where my sort of bias was initially. But there were other aspects of my mom's life that I think were probably not helping all that much in terms of her health. I mean, my mom, and not to put any blame on her or anything like that. I mean, science is evolving, and we know things now that we didn't know 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and certainly not 30 years ago. But yeah. She, was never, she never really exercised until her later years. And we now know that exercise is crucial in so many ways. It's one of the most powerful, actually disease-modifying interventions that we have for a condition called mild cognitive impairment, which is like a form of pre-dementia. It is super important for mental health. I mean, there's now, we're now at a point where we have in recent years a number of meta-analyses published showing us that whether you are anxious or depressed, exercise has a disease-modifying role to play in terms of your mental health, which is a major problem. I mean, it's the leading, depression is the leading cause of disability worldwide now, or it's set to be. And so that's something that when I look at previous generations and the fact that leisure time physical activity was not part of the, ingrained in the constitution of previous generations the way that it is now, it makes me kind of sad. And then you read statistics like that, the fact that today a third of people still do not engage in any leisure time physical activity, and it's a major problem. I mean, you look around and people are not well. Half of adults are either diabetic or pre-diabetic. 2/3 of adults are either overweight or obese, which we know, infers problems on multiple organ systems in the body, not least of which the brain. And so exercise is a big part of the problem. The Environmental Working Group estimates that your average adult now spends 93% of their time indoors, either in their cars or in their homes. So what about our indoor environments? Are we getting what our biology needs from our indoor environment? Are we getting exposure to healthy, full-spectrum light? Certainly not. When you realize how widespread and pervasive circadian disruption is. So our bodies, function on this 24-hour clock, and we need light to help anchor our body's internal clocks, which affects everything from how well we digest food, to our energy levels, to our mental acuity and alertness. So I know this sounds like a lot, but I've looked at all of these different realms, and I've tried to sort of distill them and synthesize them in a way that's accessible and approachable for readers in the book to help them arrive at some sense of how they might live for better health.
So you're obviously interested in, emotional aspects of anxiety and depression. What do you think in the modern world are the biggest triggers for that now? How is it different now?
Yeah, I think that's such a good question. The triggers they're everywhere. I think, part of it has to do with the fact that we do spend so much of our time indoors, and just getting outside into nature is such a salve for the soul. I mean, research out of Japan is now, and this research is increasingly being done around the world, but they're looking at a form of therapy called forest bathing, where they find that the minimal effective dose is just 20 minutes, just a 20-minute immersion into a natural environment, as opposed to an urban environment, can have a significant effect on levels of cortisol in the body that they were able to ascertain via a salivary test. So that's crucial. I mean, we know that stress is related to cardiovascular disease. I mean, you know better than anybody, but it's also related to worse brain health. It's obviously has an impact on mental health. Chronic stress also affects your blood pressure in a negative way. And one of the things that I look in the book, that I examine in the book, is the role of healthy blood pressure on brain function. And actually, having healthy blood pressure is essential for having a healthy brain. There was this great trial that I talk about. We're getting a little bit off the topic of mental health, but the Sprint Mind trial, which was recently published, that found that when people with high blood pressure were being treated for that with a pharmaceutical to a more aggressive degree than what they would have normally been treated at to reach an even lower systolic blood pressure, but still within the healthy range, obviously, they were significantly able to avert developing mild cognitive impairment. So, I mean, there's no pharmaceutical drug on the market specifically FDA approved to prevent MCI. So, yeah, getting out into nature, I think it's a great way to boost your mental health as well as your brain health as well. I think.
Well, wait a minute. I'm from the northern Midwest originally. Are you going to tell me that when it's 10 degrees below zero and there's a foot of snow out, that I need to go get my 20 minutes for mental health to go outside?
I think it's probably still worthwhile to be outside. It's really funny. I have a podcast also. It's also called The Genius Life, and on it I interviewed a brilliant neuroscientist from Stanford named Andrew Huberman. And he was telling me that literally, this is something that his lab studies, and so he was sharing this information with me, and I haven't read what he's published on it necessarily, but just by loosening your gaze to a more panoramic vision, you can have an effect on your body's nervous system. You can actually engage your body's parasympathetic nervous response, which is more associated with like resting and digesting and basically being not stressed out. And so that's easy to do when you're outside, right? When you perceive the perceptual vastness of an outdoor, whether it's snowing or whether you're on a mountaintop in the summer, it doesn't make a difference. But staying within the confines of our apartments, of our cars, of our offices, and keeping our eyes focused on what's immediately in front of us, I mean, that's a new axis through which we might be, getting stressed out. There's also, noise exposure. The indoor environment can sometimes be noisy, whether we have the TV on or our stereos, or we're dealing with screaming children. I don't have to deal with that yet, thankfully, but yeah, getting outside and experiencing peace and calmness and allowing your gaze to broaden out to that panoramic vision. I mean, those could all be beneficial on your mental health, no matter what time of year it is.
Yeah, I got as a kid, again, we would be out in sub-freezing temperatures, bundled up, playing all day, and we actually had like 3 changes of mittens and gloves because they get soaking wet in the snow. And we'd come in and we'd change our jeans because they get soaking wet, and then we'd run back out. And maybe we weren't that dumb after all. And our mothers and fathers would say, get in here, you're going to freeze to death. And we go, no, we got to play. We have to understand that kids instinctively understand that. It's like our dogs, come on, let's get out. My dogs look at me twice a day and say, come on, moron, let's go. And it's like, what do you mean, let's go? It's time for your walk. And I think we have to understand that kids and dogs understand this instinctively, that we got to be out there. Because that's where we came from, right? And I think that's what you say.
Exactly. There's so many things that I want to, like that you reminded me to bring up. I mean, when you look at a kid, first of all, I mean, the whole movement pattern, all the movement patterns of a child and the way that children breathe are so much healthier than the way that we do now. I'm into vocal health, actually. It's something that I think is really important. And so you want to be able to like breathe with your diaphragm. It's a lot easier to teach a kid to sing because they know how to naturally breathe than it is to teach an adult, because we tend to breathe with our chests, when you really want to practice breathing with your diaphragm. They also, if you ever watch a child squat, they squat and lift things off the floor with perfect form. So you're right, there's a lot to be learned from our children. But you also made me think about the fact that going outside in the cold, I mean, that might have mental health benefits completely independent of the fact that it's a more natural environment than our indoor environment. Our bodies have these hardwired thermoregulatory mechanisms that basically gather dust when we spend the entirety of our time inside and in the comfort bubble of chronic climate control, which is what I like to call it. But just going outside, experiencing cooler temperatures, even mild ambient cool temperature, can actually boost mental acuity, brain health, and things like that. There have been a number of interesting case reports published about people actually self-treating their own depression with like cold water swimming, so winter swimming, cryotherapy, and things like that. And the beautiful thing about these is whether or not they actually work for you, there really are no negative side effects.
Correct.
So yeah, I'm all about that more natural embrace of whether it's variation in temperature or just getting out of your comfort zone or just being outside no matter what time of year it is.
Speaking of indoor air, it's some of the worst air in the world. My wife's mother always forced them to sleep with the window open, and she grew up in Connecticut where it's pretty cold in the winter. And my mother always cracked a window, even in the dead of winter in Omaha and Milwaukee. And we still do that actually now. I curse my wife when the heat comes on. But what about opening a window or unleashing the seals of our hermetically sealed houses every now and then?
That's such a good question. It's actually something that I talk about in the book is a real medical diagnosis. It's called sick building syndrome. So a lot of people that have unexplained symptoms and they go to the doctor and the doctor sends you home and says, look, you're fine. A lot of people can actually be suffering from the confluence of pollutants that we're actually exposed to indoors, which is counterintuitive because we tend to think of pollutants being primarily outdoors, at the, on the street, for example, or in our places of employ. But Yeah, the home can actually be vastly more polluted than the outdoor environment, and that's because a lot of our, whether it's our furniture or our carpets or the paint used to coat the walls in our homes, can actually be packed with pollutants ranging from plastic compounds like BPA to phthalates, which are used to create our furniture, and even in fragrances that you'll find in common household cleaning products.
What about the new car smell? I love the new car smell.
Yeah, I mean, that new car smell is owed to a process called off-gassing. And so we're inhaling all kinds of compounds from, and I couldn't possibly name them all, but formaldehyde and things like that you definitely don't want in your system to any significant degree. We have flame retardants in our furniture. Flame retardants are also used to, in children's clothing and pajamas and things like that, and mattresses and the like. And we, originally we thought that these compounds were inert, but actually we know that they're able to enter the environment, they're able to enter the air, they're able to form the dust in our homes. So if I think it's really smart for a homeowner to have, to wet dust frequently. So if you're using like one of those dry dusters, like a feather duster, you want to get rid of that, because what you're doing is essentially you're just redistributing dust. And the primary components of dust, aside from dead skin cells, are these compounds, like little plastic nanoparticles that slough off from our furniture, from our carpets, and we breathe them in, they get into us. And so you want to wet dust so that it actually grabs up the dust, and then you want to throw that out, the cloth. It's, I think having plants in the home also really essential. Plants actually can help clean the air, and I talk about some of the plants that are most effective at doing that in the Genius Life. And yeah, so
what if you don't have a green thumb? What if you kill everything that ever lived in your house? Well, not me. I'm thinking about someone else.
I definitely don't have a green thumb, but I have some plants, like just off the top of my head, there's a plant called the rubber plant, which is very good at cleansing the air. There are definitely a handful of others. You could also get an air purifier. You can vacuum. An HVAC vacuum or air purifier is also very effective. But you're absolutely right. You should also have a well-ventilated home. And the irony is that buildings and homes now are becoming less and less well-ventilated because it saves money, right? A home that actually is more hermetically sealed, you're going to have less cost in terms of the heating and air conditioning cost, right? And so that might seem like it's a good thing, but it actually might not be such a good thing from the standpoint of our biology. Great for our wallets, but not so good for our health.
All right, so when we started this, you mentioned that, dementia was really, with your mother, was the driving force that started you down this path. What are you going to tell us in the Genius Life you can do to forestall dementia, avoid dementia? What's the tricks?
Yeah, I mean, dementia is such a huge topic, and in the United States alone, 50 million people suffer from dementia. 15 million people suffer from Alzheimer's disease alone, and those numbers are expected to explode in the coming years. So this is really a lifestyle guide, given the best available evidence, how one might live and eat to essentially avoid that condition. So there's definitely a strong nutritional component to the book, but I do talk a lot about the role of the environment on brain health. So as I mentioned, having a healthy blood pressure, that's crucial. I mean, you really should make sure that you've got your blood pressure under control. And I think that there are a lot of misconceptions when it comes to how to maintain a healthy blood pressure. So a lot of people go straight to salt, eat less salt, right? Well, actually, I think the reality is a little bit more complex than what we've been led to believe. In fact, a very large meta-analysis was recently published that found that, it wasn't necessarily the salt per se that had the biggest impact on people's cardiovascular health, but it was what they were consuming the salt with. Do people eat enough potassium? Right? So when you consume enough potassium-containing foods, where do you find potassium? You find potassium in healthy foods. Fruits, vegetables, salmon is actually a wonderful source of potassium. That any impact that sodium might have on your blood pressure, for I would say the majority of people, is going to be moot. And the other thing is that most sodium is found in packaged processed foods, which we know are not good for us. So ultra-processed foods that line our supermarket aisles and canned foods and the like, they're all saturated with sodium. And I think that it's probably the foods, not the sodium that they contain, that are the problem.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. Speaking of blood pressure, I'm going to throw in a really nerdy study. A few years ago, I usually present at the Microbiota conference over in Europe. And there was a phenomenal paper that discovered that there are olfactory nerves that not only live in our nose, but they live in our kidneys and they live in our heart. And you go, well, what the heck do you have, a nose in your kidney for, a nose in your heart? What are they there for? And what they propose, and actually have seen it in my patients, is they're actually smelling in your kidney what I call bug farts, that the microbiome produces certain compounds that are smelled by the kidney and the heart. And these compounds in what I call bad bugs are picked up by the kidney, and the kidney senses impending danger and constricts blood vessels to, the idea is to trap bacteria, which was once our mortal enemy, in the walls of the blood vessels where white blood cells could grab them and not let them out. And we can actually measure tension in blood vessels with blood tests and also with devices. And we showed that changing the microbiome and getting rid of biofilms, which we talked about in a recent podcast, actually lowers blood pressure. And I think it's because these olfactory sensors in your kidney no longer smell these bad bacteria farts, and they relax. Wow. And that's do-do-do-do. So there are ways that we're so naive about all of this, that there's nerves that smell in your kidneys and in your heart.
It's amazing. I mean, we have taste receptors in our gut.
Yeah,
that are
exactly.
on our tongue. It's like biology is so amazing, and you learn something new, or at least I feel like I do every single day about it. It's just so awe-inspiring. I wonder, so are you talking about nitric oxide? Because don't the bacteria in our mouth actually...
Well, absolutely. There's beautiful studies that if you use a mouthwash that kills off your oral microbiome, that you're no longer able to convert nitrates into nitric oxide, and your blood pressure goes up. Mm. Human studies show that blood pressure went up about 5 points systolic when you use mouthwash. And who cares about your fresh, minty breath if your blood pressure goes up? But no, this is actually a different effect. It's not a nitric oxide effect. It's a direct vasoconstriction effect.
Amazing, amazing.
It's actually based on the renin-angiotensin system. So your kidneys produce more renin to constrict your blood vessels.
Amazing.
Yeah, just because of bad bugs.
Yeah, well, I mean, the microbiome is crucially important. For everything from cardiovascular health to brain health, and it's this burgeoning line of research, and I'm so excited to learn more about it.
But let's get back to brain health and exercise, because I know you're really excited about this in the book, and your mom was not an exerciser. And in my longevity paradox, I mentioned some very good studies, particularly with women, that exercise throughout their lifespan is very good at preventing dementia. And even in the people who were genetically predisposed to develop dementia, that dementia occurred 11 years later than if they didn't exercise chronically. What's going on with that?
Exercise is medicine for the brain. It truly is. I mean, it's, when we talk about the hierarchy of things that are important when it comes to procuring good brain health, I think exercise is probably at the very top of the pyramid. In fact, the evidence now is just overwhelming. There's a new treatment guideline for physicians if you have mild cognitive impairment, which again, is a pre-dementia. It can often, and it often does, convert to more severe forms of cognitive impairment. Physicians can now and should write exercise on a prescription pad. According to the American Academy of Neurology, it's a treatment for MCI, and there is no pharmaceutical drug that's currently approved to treat MCI. So via a myriad of different pathways, exercise is crucial. It helps us to sweat, right? So when we sweat, sweating is one of the primary detox modalities. When we sweat, we release a lot of the kinds of pollutants that we were talking about earlier. It boosts a miracle grow protein in the brain called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is decreased by as much as 50% in patients with Alzheimer's disease, but we can actually boost levels of BDNF in the brain with exercise. What form of exercise? Well, I think there's a bias in the literature for aerobic exercise, but I think it's starting to come to light that whatever the form of exercise you like to do, it seems that whether it's yoga or resistance training or high intensity interval training, they all work to have a very similar effect. And in fact, I think that resistance training is probably the most important form of exercise, because when you're having a weight training workout, you actually do get a cardio workout. But
Absolutely.
I think growing stronger muscles and achieving a healthier body composition is crucially important. I mean, there's now there's a documented relationship between the strength of our muscles and the health of our brains. Muscles are important. Having stronger muscles are important for hormone homeostasis in the body. So basically making sure that your hormones are functioning the way that they ought to. Conditions like type 2 diabetes are characterized by insulin insensitivity. And there's no better way to make your body more insulin sensitive and to reverse insulin resistance than resistance training. And in terms of your mood, exercise is crucial. It helps your brain create serotonin more easily, which is a neurotransmitter involved in mood, as you know, and it's also involved in executive function, which is essentially how your brain gets stuff done. So that's crucially important. It reduces inflammation. And exercise, when put head to head against pharmaceuticals that are prescribed to treat blood pressure, exercise for people with high blood pressure works as effectively, according to a large meta-analysis that came out over the past year. So it works all of these different pathways. The problem with pharmaceutical drugs, and I'm not against pharmaceutical drugs, certainly, but
I use them if I have to.
Of course.
You break a leg, I'm going to put a cast on you.
I mean,
you're not going to wear a cast the rest of your life.
If there was a drug that I could have given my mom that would have helped her, I would have, in a heartbeat, run to the pharmacy to fill that prescription. But the problem with many of these drugs is that they target single chemicals or single biological pathways. Exercise works the entirety of the system. There's no drug on the market as powerful, in terms of its almost medicinal effect on the body as exercise. Exercise is medicine.
Okay, but it's so much easier to swallow a pill. But I think your point is really good. You got to find something that you enjoy doing.
Yes.
And again, just this week, I wrote a prescription to get a dog to one of my patients. And I've had so many patients come back with that prescription filled and framed, because they said this changed my life, because dog makes you exercise twice a day, whether you want to or not.
Yeah.
And walking, it turns out, the old idea that you had to walk 10,000 steps a day for exercise, it turns out was actually fabricated by a Japanese company that sold pedometers. And the more recent evidence says that 2,000 to 3,000 steps a day are effective. And I think the other thing that's interesting in studying, blue zones, those places in the world with extreme longevity, and I'm the only nutritionist that spent most of my career in a blue zone, Loma Linda, California. They all live in hilly communities, and they walk against gravity. And quite frankly, working against gravity is some of the best strength training that ever existed. And quick tip, there was a very famous Austrian study that wanted to see the effect of uphill hiking versus downhill hiking. And obviously they expected that uphill was a whole lot better for you than downhill. So they went to a mountain where there was a cable car, and half the participants had to hike up and then ride the cable car down. The other half had to ride up and hike down. And guess what they found, not only in cardiovascular fitness, but insulin sensitivity and muscle growth? It was exactly the same.
Our gut bacteria are really the first decision makers on whether or not you're going to absorb those calories, what's going to happen with those calories. And this was highlighted in the journal Cell. They found that they discovered a certain bacteria in mice they basically blocked their intestines from absorbing as many calories from their food. And then to see that on the surface, some folks were like, can we get a bottle of that bacteria, whatever that is, so I can stop absorbing so many calories?
That's what I'm wondering. Just kidding.
Now, here's the thing. That's not necessarily a good thing, right? But we couple that with human studies, and this was from the Weizmann Institute. We know, and I knew this in my clinical practice, I can have somebody go get a stool sample and I can get their report. We know today I can look at the bacteria makeup that you have and never see you and know whether you are obese or not based on your bacteria cascade. There is a bacteria cascade associated with obesity and insulin resistance. So this, quote, fat bacteria in human test subjects, they took these fecal samples and put them into lean mice. And they took healthy human samples and put them into lean mice. The lean mice who received the fat bacteria from humans immediately had insulin resistance, gained weight, and increased body fat.
Wow.
Simply by changing the bacteria cascade. And to put a little like cherry on top for this, a little bit before I go crazy with it. This one blew my mind. Identical twins. They took identical twins. All right. They're identical. But they'll tell you, of course, like, I'm not the same as my, whatever, you know?
Of course.
But identical twins. So everything should be the same about them, right? And they found that when one twin had the bacteria cascade associated with obesity and insulin resistance versus a healthy kind of what's deemed to be healthy cascade in identical twins eating the same exact diet, the twin with the, quote, fat bacteria more prevalent gained weight while the other one did not, eating the exact same diet. So again, when we're talking about getting into a calorie deficit and managing what's happening with our calorie intake, our microbes have a major, major role in this stuff. And also our microbes are associating with cells that are responsible for the metabolizing our hunger-related hormones. And some of our, satiety-related hormones, some of our satiety-related hormones like GLP-1, some of these are actually produced in the gut. Right. So getting our appetite in control has a lot to do with that microbiome. And yeah, so
that's so freaking cool, Sean. And it's also like, I mean, it's a really important piece of the puzzle because I think, you know, the association between like different microbial signatures with like the phenotype, like the big question mark there is like, is this microbiome composition like the consequence of, reflective of, or the cause of, right, what we see in the person? But like in that study that you cited, what's so interesting is that they actually like took the microbiome out of an obese person and they put it into the mouse and they saw the mouse phenotype change. Yeah. So that's fascinating. Cool. So let's go into like the prescription. Yeah. Because I know you're all about that, like making things actionable and achievable for your audience. So how do we then like support microbiome health? What are the kinds of foods that you recommend we steer towards? What are the kinds of foods that you recommend that we steer away from? Like what's your, how is your, and also how has your dietary philosophy evolved, over the course of writing this book?
Yeah. Oh man, such a good question. Again, I think the heart of all of it is understanding that you have a unique metabolism and we have to be open, like for me, even going into this book, I knew that there was a lot of infighting in our community about minutia and not really focusing on what are the main principles that make any of these diet frameworks successful. And so many people develop this, it's like religiosity around their diet when it's successful for them, but over maybe they do it for 2 years even, it's working, but then all of a sudden it's not working as well. And we blame the diet. No, I'm sorry. We don't blame the diet. We blame ourselves. It's just like, I need to paleo harder. I just need to keto harder. I need to vegan harder, right? I'm not veganing enough. I really need to clean up my act. And of course, there are pieces of that can be true, but sometimes our diet frameworks don't allow for the thing that you need right now, and we have to, my mission is for us to just open up a little bit and give ourselves permission to have the thing that your genes, your microbiome might be calling for to help to heal you. And so with that said, this is really rooted in, we're talking about that microbiome cascade. I did so much experimentation myself. Like I couldn't really speak from a place of efficacy if I didn't do this stuff myself. So I'll do the diet, but I'll do it for a year, 2 years, 3 years. Raw food, okay, I'll do it for a year. Keto, okay, I'll do it for a year. Paleo, I'll do it for 2 years, Vegan, give me 3. You know, like I've done this stuff.
She's 3 years on a vegan diet.
It's 5. But here's the thing. Each of these changes in your nutrient intake changes your microbes. That is the number one thing when we're talking about helping to heal this issue, is knowing that number one, the diversity of your microbes is directly associated with the higher your diversity, the lower your rate of obesity, the lower your rate of diabetes, the lower your correlated body weight. It's directly linked. And so in looking at hunter-gatherer tribes and just folks eating more of an indigenous diet, they found that on average, they have 4 times, upwards of like 10 times more diversity in their microbes than the average Western world person, you know, that eating our typical diet, you know, standard American diet. 4 times more. Just say you have, I don't know, 1,000 different species. They got 4,000.
Jeez.
And so the question is, what happened? And what it is just like some people refer to the microbiome as like a rainforest. Like we have endangered species. You know, we have many that have gone extinct. And some of the data is, and I don't like this because I don't like to speak in extremes, but some of the data is like, you can't get them back once they're gone, you know, and I don't completely believe that. It's really about providing the food source for the microbes to get a chance to come back. It's just like anything in nature. Like you have to have the food that you want to just stick around. And so when you pull out a whole food group, then maybe your genes really, but maybe you had an issue with the digestion of it because of the way it was prepared. So you pull the beans out, for example. This is not an advocation for beans. Okay, just calm down. But maybe for your genes and maybe for your ancestry, maybe this was like a staple. You know, maybe it was dal, you know, like the mung beans or whatever. Dengu if you're Kenya, you know, and maybe you've been eating it for centuries. But now you're here in the States and you're not making it the same way your grandmother used to or whatever. And now like you have some digestive issues or maybe like skin issues, and then you do an elimination diet and you remove this, and the microbes go too, because they were eating that food. That was the prebiotic, right? These terms, but we really got to get this. It's not just like a supplement you take. This is the food for your microbes. And so that's at the heart of it. Number one is being more focused and on diversity, because the number one, and I shared a really great study in Eat Smarter, of increasing your diversity of foods increases your diversity of microbes, which is just so obvious, but we have data on it now. So even if we're eating healthy, you know, quote healthy, we still can get into the meal prep gone awry, you know, where it's just like, you know, you're doing the same stuff just on rotation, and we need more diversity, you know. So some of the common prebiotic foods is like, you know, asparagus, Jerusalem artichoke, onions and garlic. You know, we hear these things, but some of the most fascinating, I think so much science is going to come out in the upcoming years, is resistant starch, you know, and I was resistant to resistant starch.
You were resistant to resistant starch, Sean Stevenson?
We could put that. That's a tweetable. That's a tweetable. And I was having, this was many years ago, but I was experiencing dysbiosis because of all the experimentation I was doing. And I was eating what I believed to be the right thing. But over time, like I start to have more food sensitivities. And so I would just like, oh, let's just eliminate that. Then I got into my like safe foods list. And then I started getting nervous if I eat a different food, which then I knew like, oh, something's wrong. Like I got to stop this. And, you know, a physician friend of mine was like, well, maybe you should try adding in, you know, this particular, which I didn't know at the time was a resistant starch. And I was like, I don't know about that. Brown rice? No. You know, I know it's got the, you know, it's the anti-nutrients in there, you know, gut irritants, but
arsenic too in brown rice.
There you go. But it's got, when I was in school, in my traditional, like my nutritional science class at my university, and this was like, you know, this is back in the day, you know, I've been in the game for a while, but we were taught basically everything brown, you should be down, right? You should be down with it, like brandy. You know, everything that's brown is good. The white is not good, right? So white rice, out. White potatoes, out, right? But the thing was that even then, I still had the insight. I was like, why when I go to, you know, my favorite Chinese food restaurant, like I see the owners there eating white rice and vegetables, whatever. They're definitely not eating the hot braised chicken that I'm eating, you know. But I'm just like, did they not get the memo that brown is better? What's wrong? Centuries, guys? Come on, guys. And what it was is just centuries ago, they figured out like there's a gut irritant here and we could just, you know, strip that away. And this is not saying that white rice is some glorious nutritive source, but it's just like making it safer for the average person. Okay, now that's just a part of it. It's a slice of it. Not to say that brown rice can't be helpful or healthy for some folks, but what can we do to help to reduce, you know, the phytates, reduce the anti-nutrients? Soak it and use a pressure cooker, right? And so I started to do that. I would actually get sprouted rice, brown rice, and I started to add it in. I started feeling better. And I'm like, oh shit, like my belief system is starting to crumble because I was like, I'm not eating that stuff. You know, same thing. There's beans, but also something really cool that's coming forward in this work is that the colors of food are dramatically associated with the nutrition that's in the food, right? So this category of like white, beige, like brown stuff is high in resistant starch, potentially. And so here's what's the interest with resistant starch. So white rice, if it's cooked and then cooled, the resistant starch content shoots up.
Wow.
All right. And then if it's cooled and then reheated, it goes up even higher.
Wow.
So your microbes like that are associated, you know, we got bacteroidetes and firmicutes. The bacteroidetes, well, firmicutes, if you want, this was the saying, I didn't make this up. If you want to be firm and cute, you got to reduce the firmicutes.
You got to reduce the firmicutes.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so the bacteroidetes love, it's associated with leanness, love resistant starch. Love it. And so white rice can actually be helpful, which is, again, that's very counterculture, but everything it's nuanced. This doesn't mean to start going ham on white rice, but I just want to make sure the data is available because rice is a big staple in many people's diets. How do you do it? And so I do like a little sidebar. It's called Rice Baby in the book, you know, and
I like it. 90s hip hop throwback pun.
One of the other ones, just a super common, is a banana. Okay. What a controversial food this is, you know, but for, you know, just growing up here in the States, like bananas like that handy dandy, you know, go-to. But as we know, it's been genetically manipulated for a long time now to eliminate the seeds, you know, like, and I put a picture of a wild banana in the book. They're like almonds, like they're like huge seeds. It was like really, it took a lot of energy and work to get anything from the banana. Like you had to work around it. And if you're eating the seeds, you're also getting fats along with it too. But they've been bred to be more sweet and get rid of those seeds. I remember even when I was a kid, there was still like these little bitty teeny seeds. They're gone now. Bananas, even if they're organic, they cannot reproduce in nature on their own anymore. They need human intervention. We've made them impotent.
Wow, we've made the irony too, given a bananas, you know, the association that bananas have with. Anyway,
that's right. It was an awkward day in 8th grade health class for me, man. The banana came out, you know, not mine. Never mind.
Yes.
There's a teacher is a demonstration, just to be clear. But as the banana, you know, the green banana is high in starch, specifically this resistant starch. But as it gets more yellow, it starts to it transitions from starch into sugar. And so, but now nobody likes a green banana, you know? Well, I'm sorry. There's probably somebody that's like, I do. But maybe if you take a little bit of a green banana and like throw it into a smoothie, you get some of that resistant starch. There's green banana flour is getting pretty popular right now.
They'd never even seen that. That's awesome.
Yeah. So like making little baked goods, just kind of, you know, sliding that in there. But even if the banana is like ripe, like the yellow banana, but now it's like pretty high in sugar. But this still doesn't mean that it's bad. Like you could still, everything has its place.
Of course.
You know, and if it's in combination with some other things as well. But there's still that one the little tip of the banana, that little brown tip, even when it's called the devil's anus. You know, it's that little nasty part of the banana.
At the front of the banana?
It's at the bottom. That's right.
It's the devil's anus.
The devil's anus, yeah.
Never gonna look at bananas the same again.
That's right.
Every banana has an anus. Is that what we're learning here?
I'm thinking, was it Thor Ragnarok? Like they went into that hole. I think it was like, I think that might have been called the devil's
the
anus.
Cosmic anus?
Yeah, something like that.
Interesting.
Shout out to Thor.
I mean, we all have them. No shame, you know? So bananas, man. If you know what's interesting is like, you're so right. that they've been cultivated, right, to contain more starch and sugar than ever before in human history. But still, people are like, it's whole fruit. You know, there's nothing wrong with eating whole fruit, and I agree with that. Like, eat whole fruit. But if you just kind of like extrapolate out, what if we bred the banana to be even bigger and bigger and big? Like, at what point would it be reasonable to suggest maybe not eating them all the time? You know what I'm saying? Like, I go sometimes, depending on, like, you know, the season, and I see apples at like my local supermarket.
Yeah.
And sometimes you'll find apples that are bigger than your head.
Yeah, it's crazy.
You know?
It's crazy. When and the true origins of many of these foods, it'll fascinate you, you know, when you find out the size of an apple is tiny. And also even lettuce. You know, lettuce was a narcotic, you know, it's basically had psychoactive properties, and they've been bred over time so that the lettuce, of course, it was alkaloids. You know, they bred it to be, you know, just safe, little, unsuspecting, whatever. Back in the day, if you ate a salad, I mean, you'd be higher than, you know, Snoop Dogg doing that Mike Tyson fight. You know, it's just like, what?
Yeah.
But that's one really cool aspect. But something else too in this domain, I actually put a study, and I actually put a graph into the book looking at folks, because again, you make the assumption the banana is clearly going to be better for you than a cookie. It depends on the person. All right. Because the banana, again, is coming with some micronutrients, and, you know, it's a real whole food. And not to say, for me, it already supersedes it. However, if just looking at the impact on the blood sugar of these folks, some folks would eat a banana and they would get a crazy blood sugar spike and then the preceding crash, like they go hypoglycemic. And they eat a cookie, it's as if they ate nothing. Just the blood sugar just stayed so stable. Versus other folks, you know, they have what you would think, which is like they eat the cookie and they have the spike and crash, and the banana is just kind of like a little bit of a spike. So, and what the researchers were leaning into is that a big player in this is most likely their microbiome, and how their microbiome is associating with the different foods. So one food for somebody could be detrimental versus somebody else. And this is stuff that we know, we talk about it, but now we've got some data. And I want to make sure everybody knows.
That's so interesting. I love what you were saying about rice being cooked and cooled. You know what? I eat sushi a lot, and I feel very comfortable eating sushi rice because it's basically that. It's been cooked and cooled, right? It's just like sitting there cooling off. Plus, they add vinegar to sushi rice, and vinegar we know has an anti-hyperglycemic effect.
Yeah,
as well. What's your stance on? We've talked about plants and resistant starch, which I love. Super important. Surfacing that for listeners. What's your stance on like omnivory? Like, are you pro, anti meat? Like, what have you, chicken, fish? Like, what's your stance there?
Yeah. Again, for me, this is a unifier. Eat Smarter is a unifier. Whatever diet framework anybody subscribes to, they'll know the things that make it effective across the board, and also the things on any diet framework that can really mess you up. And I call them like the three amigos of fat storage. You know? And what it really boils down to, and this is, for me, I always like to just lean onto the side of rationality, and lean onto the side of what have we done the longest as humans? And what do our genes expect of us? So it's a bigger conversation. It isn't just like this new trendy thing. Like, what have we done as humans? And so we evolved eating plants and animals. You know, that's what we have to really just come to face to face with that. And, you know, folks can be like, well, there's this culture over here, you know, they ate mostly plants. They still had some animal products. And this is, again, we're talking about millions of years of evolution, even just in recent history, centuries and centuries, most recent. It's only been in the last few decades that some folks make the decision to completely pull out animal foods. And I understand. I do understand. And also I know that you can be successful on a plant-based diet, but you have to be clever, because there are certain things you absolutely need that most folks, and the body is so resilient and also very good at storing things. So it might be great for you like the first year. Like, you get a first year vegan? Oh, you can't tell them nothing. Oh my gosh. But then, you know, see me 5 years from now. And always, of course, and then there's like the anomaly, you know, it's been vegan, you know, for 20 years or whatever. But one of the biggest issues that I want to make sure today, moving forward for all of us, but in particular, I want to give a little sidebar for folks who are taking a vegan and vegetarian approach, how freaking important DHA is and EPA. Like, I want everybody to get this. This might be like top 5 things that we need to survive, and to not just survive, to thrive as humans. And so, number one, in looking at what's happening with the brain, our brain is the most ravenous organ. Like, it's only about 2% of our body weight, but it's absorbing and consuming about 25% of our calories. Like, it is hungry. And your brain, and this study freaked me out, but this is one of those moments I was by myself and I get to talk about it, Max. I'm glad. I could not believe this. Your brain will gladly absorb, if you just, let me relax. It will gladly consume about 50% of the glucose in your bloodstream. All right. So it's not a joke, because we have these sugar gates, the blood-brain barrier, just express pathway for sugar. And so when you're drinking a soda or you're eating, this crazy amount of sugar, the stuff that I just grew up doing every day, a tremendous amount of that is fucking up your brain, like immediately, and creating insulin resistance in your brain. You have receptors in your brain, the pathways into let's start there. The brain, being that it's the most complex organ in the known universe, right? It's just so powerful, but it's ironic because it's also the most delicate, right? But it's also, nature doesn't come to the party without some equipment. You have your cranium to protect you. It's the only organ that's fully encased in bone to protect you from external intrusions. But internal intrusions as well can kill you. So we develop the blood-brain barrier. Now, here's the thing, and we know this has been something we've talked about for many years, how important fat is for the brain. Now, there's nuance here, because your brain only allows in very particular nutrients. It is very selective in what can cross over the blood-brain barrier and feed your brain. And saturated fat has been vilified and vindicated and vilified and vindicated. From real whole foods, pretty good for you. But as far as feeding the brain, because a nice portion of the brain is saturated fat. Here's the thing. When you're a baby, the gates, the blood-brain barrier allowing saturated fat in, it's like sopping it up like a biscuit, all right? Even mother's milk can be upwards of 50% saturated fat.
Wow.
For a reason. It's for the development of the brain in early childhood. However, as an adult, it's all but not allowing saturated fat in. Your brain will make it itself. Wow. The brain is so cool. So now with DHA and EPA, now this is where it gets really important. The fats in the brain are not like the other fats in your body, all right? We have storage fats. When people are talking about like burning fat, the white adipose tissue, these are storage fats. So visceral fat, subcutaneous fat, intramuscular fat, these are storage fats. The fat in it was an evolutionary advantage to make sure that your brain is not storage fat, so that in times of famine, your brain isn't eating itself.
Right.
All right? Now, the fats in your brain, these are structural fats. All right? And so allowing that to cross the blood-brain barrier, omega-3s, specifically DHA and EPA, these are really the core of the structural fats to make your brain cells. The structure of the cell, the signal transduction, the ability for them to talk. You have to have these structural fats. And so what the data found was that they took MRIs and actually found that the folks consuming the least, like under 3 grams of DHA, had massive amounts of brain shrinkage. And this isn't like the shrinkage because it's cold outside. This is like permanent mess you up.
Yeah.
And so here's the thing. And this was the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. They found that when folks simply added in more DHA and EPA into their diet, they had measurable, and this is versus a placebo, measurable improvements in their memory and their reaction time just by adding in more like these are things, it's just like, it's not just about prevention. This can make your brain work better quickly. And so the target here is just a little bit over a teaspoon of DHA and EPA. And then of course, for me, I'm always like food first. And this is getting into the conversation about what spectrum are you at with your dietary choices from vegan to carnivore. We know, and this is based on the data, that fish is the best source that you're going to find. And specifically fatty fish. So, salmon, mackerel, sardines, but also their eggs. So fish eggs, so caviar, salmon roe. There's like 10 times more in salmon roe than you'll find in the salmon, which is, again, like, if you're freaked out by that, you don't have to have it. There's other sources. But then folks will have this, and this is something that I believed, when I was doing the vegan approach. I was like, I'm cool. Like, I'll get my omega-3s from my plants. It's ALA. It's not the same thing. It's not the same thing. And ALA has value, and I go through and talk about that in the book, but DHA is so important, your body will convert some of the ALA into DHA and EPA, but you lose like at least 75% in the process, in the conversion process. So for you to get the amount of DHA and EPA that you actually need to have a healthy brain, you're going to have to like beer bong chia seeds all day. Like, you're just going to have to constantly have that rolling in, and you might as well set up shop in your bathroom and just sit there all day.
Also like there's variation in terms of the way different like gender differences, right? Like men, I believe, are not like effective at all. I mean, men can basically, like just beer bong ALA essentially and not enrich the brain with DHA at all as a result. Women, I think they, if I recall correctly, they have like a little bit more leeway, and certain different ethnic backgrounds, like
all that matters.
Yeah.
And of course the microbiome, like, what is your gut going to do in this whole process? And part of what you just said, man, I love talking to you. Part of that is an evolutionary advantage to feed a baby. And babies, they're going to siphon from the mother all the DHA and EPA that the baby can get. It's critical for the development of the child. And so this is something that mothers really, even in pre-pregnancy, if at all possible, really make sure that our DHA and EPA levels are up. But that's one of those things, like you said, depending on our gender. And that's not accounted for in a calorie label, on a food label. None of this stuff, you know, the gender differences. So that's one part. Now with the structural fat. So what do we do if we're doing a plant-based approach? And these are critical. And I hope I'm making this very clear today, how critical this is. And now we could talk about other areas of it though, too. But okay, so we have to look at where do you lie on your ethics, because in the data, so fish first, and by the way, with fish, and I want to see, like, does this actually show up on, actually eating the fish, does this show up in improvements? And so Rush University researchers did a study, and they found that folks eating just one seafood meal per week perform better on cognitive skills tests than folks eating less than one seafood meal per week. It's right. We've got the data.
Autoimmune diseases are when your immune system is overactive and they attack an otherwise healthy organ that doesn't need to be attacked. It's kind of the way that I'm like, that's the easiest way to explain it to me. So for me, it's my colon, there are white blood cells in there that are causing inflammation, and it's trying to fight something off that's not present. People can have, psoriasis, and it can attack their skin, MS. I mean, there's I think 180, 200 or so known autoimmune diseases. Then there's things like lupus that actually can affect your entire body. But essentially that's the way that I've come to understand it.
Wow. It's amazing that you, as you mentioned, you visited all these doctors and they gave to you basically what I've come to call diagnose and adios. They were just like,
yeah.
Take these drugs. There's this incredible meme. I don't know if you've seen it circulating on social media, but it's like there's a woman sitting on the, I don't know what it's called, but like the bench in the doctor's office, and she looks really unhappy, and she's got like, spots all over her face, and she clearly, like, the cartoonist drew her to depict how miserable she was feeling, and the quote underneath,
right.
There's a doctor looking at her, and the doctor's like, well, all your labs look normal, looks like you're okay,
Right.
But I mean, so often there are these underlying latent conditions going on, and it really takes becoming your own health investigator, like what you've done, to get to the root cause. So I just want to
right.
like applaud you in your journey.
Well, thank you. It's when you feel that helpless and hopeless at that point, I think a lot of times it is hard for people to want to push through, because it's just so much to think about, and you don't know the right questions to ask, and you don't know the right tests to request, and that's like, something that you hope and expect your doctor to guide you towards. And I definitely had those frustrating. I mean, it took, multiple specialists to finally even get tests and then to be diagnosed. And then even after diagnosis, yeah, I mean, I was sent out the door after a week-long hospital stay of, this is what you have. It's uncurable. You'll have it for life, but just take this. And that was kind of it. They never actually even told me about autoimmunity. They didn't mention those, like that it was an autoimmune disease. They just, kind of sent me out. And we asked why and, how. And that was just kind of like, well, we don't really know, and that was pretty much all the answers we got. So I had to take it into my own hands. It's also just the kind of person I am. But I just had to keep searching and researching and trying to learn about it on my own.
I love that. I can totally relate. So you mentioned that you were, you started scouring these online message boards back in 2007, and you stumbled upon this like grain-free, dairy-free lifestyle. When you first saw, that mentioned, I mean, like what was going through your head? Because grains, because like growing up in the 80s and 90s, grains I thought were this amazing thing that you've got to eat 7 times a day, right?
Right. Right.
So like, what was your?
Definitely what we were taught.
Yeah.
You know what, to be quite honest with you, I remember being like, I don't even know what a grain is. Yes. Like I always heard whole grain is most, it's the healthiest and you're supposed to eat it all the time. And we got rid of like the Wonder Bread and started eating whole grain bread and that type of thing. But if you could have asked me to list the actual foods that were grains, I had no idea. So it was a massive learning curve for me. So I think when I first saw it, it probably didn't hit me just how much stuff I was going to have to cut out. It was more of just like, okay, well, this is working. Let's try to give it a shot. But when I really started flipping the ingredient list and looking and like, oh, wow, everything that I'm eating has, grains in it or dairy or soy or corn or, things like that. That was really the kind of eye-opening moment of like, okay, there's a lot we have to change here. And there's a lot I have to, go through and just completely like revamp my kitchen, revamp my pantry. And then on the other side of things, I didn't know how to cook, any other way. I mean, I was pretty young as it was and didn't do a whole lot of cooking in college, but anything I did know how to make came from my mom, my grandma, and it all used grains. So it was a fairly big shift. And it took me a long time. I might always like to say that because I think it's a mental thing for people, I mean, you're grieving your diagnosis and you're grieving all of these foods. And then you're just in this kind of deer in headlights kind of time for a little while where you're just like, I don't even know what to do. It's just so much. And then there's this commitment that you have to make, and that was mentally really hard for me. I'd commit and then I'd fall off and I'd go back and, and I wouldn't see the improvement that I wanted at first, but that's because maybe I was doing 5 days of doing well, but then I'd, go and eat whatever I wanted on the weekends. And so my body just wasn't even having time to recover. So it was a good few years before I really set, my mind to it and was like, no going back. This is it. This is the only way that I can live a full and happy life.
Did you, was there any point at which you grieved grains?
Oh yeah. I mean, grains, dairy, all of it. Yeah. I loved a baguette with cheese. Like I loved a good bowl of oatmeal in the morning. So yeah, there was a long period of time. I'm also like, I'm known now for my baked goods. And it's just, I grieved the celebratory things like, getting to throw a party for family and friends and having a cake or a pie or something like that. Or, it had been another wave when I had started having kids. I have 3 kids and I, went through this kind of wave at the beginning of my first son. He's 10 now, but just this feeling of like, oh, like moms are supposed to be able to make cookies with their kids and sit and enjoy them. Or like there's a birthday party at school and I really want him to not feel left out. And so there were multiple kind of times where I grieved the foods that I couldn't have. And that's really what set me on the path of starting to create my own recipes, because I just was like, I refuse to be this young and live the rest of my life feeling like I'm missing out on all of the things that are important to me and the traditions and the like nostalgic times that I remember as a child.
Yeah. I mean, looking over your Instagram, it doesn't look like you're missing out on anything. It's just so, it's just so funny. Like growing up, like every meal had to have a grain for me,
right,
like it was either like a sandwich or a wrap or a brown rice bowl or whole wheat pasta. I remember being such a huge fan. I couldn't envision life without grains. But now it's funny, like not only do I never think about grains, I can't really envision life with them, or at least with them taking up the kind of real estate on my plate that they used to take up.
That's what I was going to say. They definitely took up. I mean, I was going to say the same word with real estate. It's like I feel like that was the majority of what filled us up as kids. It was like a teeny portion of vegetables, if any, a little bit of meat, and then whatever it was, that big starch, on the side. And I always say, when I first started eating this way, paleo was very big, and that's the word that was used a lot just because it classified my recipes. And there was this, kind of caricature at the time going around with like a person just eating this like massive turkey leg, and that's kind of what people thought, that it was just all meat heavy all the time. And I always said I eat more vegetables now than I did before, because there's more space on my plate that I can fill, and I also realized just how nutrient dense and healthy they are and how great they are for my body. But I'm like, cutting out the grains didn't mean for me adding more meat necessarily or other things to fill that in. It was like, oh wow, I actually have expanded my view to eating and filling up more on vegetables.
Yeah, love that. Speaking of vegetables, so in your own personal health journey, there's a lot of talk these days about lectins, inducing what's called molecular mimicry, aggravating people's immune systems when they have active autoimmunity. So have you found that there are any vegetables that you seem to do better, without, or like what's your current diet look like these days?
So the only thing that I found, and it just depends, if I'm symptomatic, which this has not been a perfect journey. I actually had a really bad setback last year, but I've done incredibly well considering and compared to what I used to be. But when I'm symptomatic, vegetables are hard if they're not cooked, and that's pretty standard for anybody with a digestive disease, especially things like leafy greens and things like that. But otherwise, the only one that I don't do a lot of, or I don't really do at all, are white potatoes. And it kind of depends. I can do some nightshades, if they're cooked. I don't do a ton of tomatoes. But the lectin thing I think is interesting. I've been really trying to study and learn kind of over the last couple of years. It's fairly new, all things considered, with my full journey from 2007. But I haven't found it to be super detrimental for me, just in terms of like the seeds in a cucumber or things like that. But I do think there's something to it. And I think everybody's bodies are different. That's what I found. I'm like, I think there's this kind of good baseline, but then there might be nuanced things here and there. But yeah, really just raw stuff when I'm not feeling well. And then white potatoes just don't do well for me. They can cause inflammation, and I get bloated and my joints can hurt, and I just kind of stay away from them.
Oh man. Yeah. I didn't want it to sound like I was endorsing like removing lectins or anything like that, but it's just been interesting because a lot of people today, whether it's sort of a more, well, I guess like Gundry-esque approach, who have cut the lectins out or have gone full-blown carnivore. It just seems that, some people with active autoimmunity, like it's not just the removal of grains that bring on a reprieve of symptoms. It's a more extreme version of that. So I was just wondering if you sort of dabbled in any of those more extreme dietary patterns.
No, I haven't, aside from paleo, or occasionally I kind of revert to like an autoimmune protocol when I'm not feeling well, which cuts out the nuts, the seeds, the nightshades. So that definitely is a little bit more extreme. But I found that I don't have to do that all the time, which I'm grateful for. It's really just in order to kind of get symptoms at bay. But really for me, it's grain and dairy free, no refined sugars, no legumes. But in addition to that, I found and really learned the hard way over the last few years that I actually really have to take care of my body as a whole. I have to make sure that I'm prioritizing rest. I have to make sure I'm prioritizing not being stressed and anxiety and all of those things. And they really kind of go hand in hand with the way that I eat.
Stress is massive. A stressful event can cause a flare up, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I knew that, but I didn't really take it seriously. And that's what put me into such a bad setback last year. I just didn't have the boundaries that I needed to, and ran myself into the ground no matter how well I was eating. So I've learned my lesson, but I'm sure I'll probably, stumble again at some point.
Man, well, glad you're on the mend. So how did you then come to start your blog Against All Grain?
Yeah, so I started my blog in 2009, I believe. I might have started in 2008, but I didn't really much on it. I was starting to get into the kitchen and create recipes. Again, it was like there might have been one or two blogs at that point. I don't think were any cookbooks, maybe very shortly thereafter. And so I just felt at a loss. I felt like the food I was eating was cardboard, and I just felt very deprived and was like, this is not the life I want. I grew up in a very large Italian family that hosted big. My grandmother still to this day, 86 years old, and still hosts our family, not right now, sadly, but and 30, 40 people at a time. And that was the way she showed her love, was through food. And that was really kind of how I felt too. I wanted to bring people around my table to create community around food. And I couldn't eat the, chicken and steamed broccoli for the rest of my life. So I started getting into the kitchen and just recreating a lot of things that I grew up eating, like substituting out things for the regular dinner, recipes that I grew up eating. And then got into the baked goods. And my husband was the one who suggested starting a blog. He just was like, you should start a blog. And so he set me up with the WordPress, and I just started snapping photos of the things I was creating with my phone, and I was sharing the recipes with neighbors and coworkers, and they were all giving good feedback on them, and they would all ask for the recipes. And so I was like, well, it's an easier way to just type it up and, put it up there, and they can use it, and I don't have to hand it out to multiple people. And it was also just a way to kind of catalog my journey, and then eventually became a way to connect with other people who were suffering like I was. When I first started it, I just figured it would be like my grandma, my mom, and my sister that were reading it. But I started a Facebook page, I think around 2011, and started publishing the recipes there, and just started seeing it grow and grow. And I think probably the biggest thing that I noticed were people were feeling the same. They just really wanted to be able to enjoy those pastimes, especially other parents and things like that. But that also they just needed to find somebody who knew what they were going through. And that's what I felt like I needed too. I didn't have anybody in my life that was walking the same journey of going through an autoimmune disease. And so I think we just kind of formed this community and this bond, which I've been so grateful for over the years. But yeah, that's kind of how it started. It started with just me in the kitchen, just experimenting.
It's so cool. And so that kind of blossomed into these 4 cookbooks that you've written at this point?
Yeah, it did. So about a year or so after I started the blog, I got a call from a publisher, and they offered me a deal. And the story I thought was cool was because the woman who worked there, son had an autoimmune disease, and he was young, and he went to a school where they had cereal day every week, and he couldn't do grains, and he felt super left out. And I have this granola recipe that's like soaked in sprouted nuts that are dehydrated and sweetened with honey. And so she would make that for him and send it with almond milk or something like that, or coconut milk. And he felt like he could be part of the celebration every week again. And so she showed my blog to the publisher, and that's how my first book came about. And then it went on from there.
That's amazing. How do you?
Yeah.
You mentioned that you have 3 kids. I mean, I don't have any. I don't have any kids that I know of, at least. So this is not a topic that I can speak to particularly well. But how do you balance? Like, how do you balance being a mom, having 3 kids around, having these dietary restrictions with kids who basically want to eat whatever is pleasurable to them?
Yeah, it's been an interesting journey. So for my first son, at first I just didn't realize, like, I was changing everything about the way I was eating, but I was still doing all the normal quote unquote things that most American parents do for their kids, like buying the, box flaked oatmeal or rice cereal that you mix up, or giving them, all the like cheese crackers, the fish crackers, just all those things that I just were like, oh, okay. And then I started moving into kind of like, okay, well, I should at least get organic versions of those. So it was a kind of a slow process. But then after time, I just realized, like, if this is as important to my body as it is, and I started learning more and more about how autoimmune diseases can be hereditary. My children were also born via C-section, which can make them even more susceptible to it. And so it really became a passion of mine to make sure that I tried to prevent at all costs that they would get what I had. So my younger 2 have just kind of been raised on it. I think they know spaghetti squash, and they know, that's like, they don't know normal noodles. They do a little bit. I always say, they're 100% gluten-free. 85% of the time they eat grain-free, paleo kind of diet, but then I'll buy like some whole brown rice pasta for them because they can tolerate it. And it doesn't seem to bother them, but we do no artificial sugars, no artificial food dyes, everything's pretty pretty clean. But that's partially why I became passionate about recreating the things like the cupcakes and the cookies and things, because, I mean, they're going to be exposed to that kind of stuff. And it doesn't matter how much you tell a 5-year-old that it's the best for them, that they don't eat it. It's like they need to at least feel like they're part of it. And so I send, my own cupcakes to school for them, or they keep like a bag in the freezer of something of mine so that when there's a party at school, they can like pull it out. And that was very apparent early on as like even a preschooler, sending different snacks to school, and just how they as they're growing up, they're learning how to be part of society and how, to be part of the world. And it's really surprising how much food is a part of that, and how you can really feel ostracized, based on how you eat. And I felt it as an adult, so I can't even imagine a little one. So we talk a lot, about my disease. Unfortunately, they have seen me, bedridden at times here and there. They've seen me sick. And so without trying to scare them, we talk about why it's important that we eat this way, and that it helps mommy stay healthy so that I can be, there for them. And I think they really understand it. I mean, again, like they're going to be 16 and they're going to go to a friend's house and probably down like 4 boxes of mac and cheese. And it's going to happen at some point. Like I know it's going to. But the biggest thing for me is trying to help them see the correlation of how their body feels after they eat things. We've had those circumstances here and there over the years of like going to a movie with a friend and getting the candy and popcorn and coming home and feeling gross and their stomach hurts. And, I try to tell them like, hey, did you feel like that before you went to the movie and before you ate that? And so just really trying to just show them to like listen to their bodies. That's kind of the way I've tried to approach it. And they're going to make bad decisions, but my hope is that the foundation that's laid, and just trying to understand from a young age that food can make you feel a certain way, but good or bad, that they'll hopefully make good decisions as they get older.
I love that. Like a gentle coaxing.
Yeah, exactly.
Is all it takes. Yeah. I mean, I ate tons of crap growing up.
I know. Same.
Tons, like McDonald's. I ate.
Yep.
I remember God, Lunchables, Dunkaroos.
Oh yeah.
Fruit roll-ups,
all of it.
Pop-Tarts,
We
cereal.
must have grown up around the same time, because those were all the things. Yes, all of them. Pizza Pockets or Hot Pockets. Yeah. I mean, my mom was like the queen of frozen processed foods. And that was I feel like our generation. That's just, it's stuff we grew up on. Sometimes I poke fun at her and I'm like, you wonder why I have this disease, but it's something they couldn't, they didn't know any better. But yeah, I had the friends, I feel like we all had, especially kids who grew up in like the 90s, we all had that one friend whose mom was very like super strict. They never ate chocolate. They only ate carob, or they only ate like the whole grains, or they were never allowed this or that. And then you went to college with that friend and they like nosedive, ate all the things. And, and so I'm like, my thought with raising my kids, I'm like, I'm not going to try to I don't want to deprive them. I don't want them to go off and like try to rebel and go the other direction. I want to like bring them into it. They cook a lot with me. I want to talk with them. Like I want to, try to have them have this understanding and belief of it, that it's not just something that like I'm imposing on them.
Yeah, I love that. How do you handle eating out, going to restaurants?
Well, so I live in the Bay Area, so I'm pretty fortunate in that like most of the restaurants around here are really accommodating. I mean, I feel like from when I was diagnosed, especially where you would say gluten-free and they'd look at you like you had like 5 heads, to now even understanding grain-free. So, most menus these days have it listed what things can be modified or what's gluten-free. Thankfully, I don't have celiac, so I can eat in a place that's cross-contaminated. I'm not that sensitive to gluten, at least. But when I travel, which I do a lot for work normally, not this year, I tend to find places that I spend a lot of time on Yelp. My friends always make fun of me because I'm like looking for lunch when we're at breakfast of like, okay, where can we go that's safe? But I like to try to find places that I know have good quality, like grass-fed meats and organic, poultry and local organic vegetables. And then I know like, okay, I can probably modify something if they're like at least focusing on quality. Worst case scenario, if I'm like stuck, I'll get a salad and I'll just do olive oil and lemon juice, or I'll get a lettuce wrap burger or something if like I'm stuck and I just can't. But for the most part around here, we can eat pretty easily and we can actually really enjoy a lot of the places, which I'm super grateful for.
Yeah, that's awesome. I feel like California, we're so lucky living in this state,
Yes.
in many ways.
Yes.
in the sense that we, it really is the epicenter of the healthy, holistic food movement, whatever you want to call it, in the U.S. And it has been that way for decades.
Right. And everything's so fresh too. I mean, it's like our produce, and it's like we can get mostly everything year round. I mean, we're very fortunate in that way. And there's such, I mean, I think this is where like the farm to table, kind of movement originally kind of started, I feel like, just with everything being local and fresh, and that's such a priority. And so, yeah, I mean, it's definitely easier here than it is in some places in the Midwest and the South. That's for sure.
So you've talked about how you've been able to adapt some of your indulgences to your new lifestyle, all the baked goods that pepper your Instagram so beautifully. What about, what's your take on alcohol and how that affects ulcerative colitis?
Yeah, so I don't do any grain-based alcohol, clearly, although I am somewhat of the mind that it's kind of not fermented, but distilled out. But still, I kind of stay away from it. I just don't know how it's going to react. I occasionally will do 100% agave tequila. I like a good margarita that's made with honey. That's like if I'm gonna do something as a drink, like I'll make something like that. I love a glass of red wine. I've over the last 5 or 6 years, I've realized that if I drink a glass that's organic and biodynamic, doesn't have any added sugars and the sulfites and the coloring, that I can tolerate it just fine. I mean, again, it's like if I'm noticing any sort of symptoms, I just stay away from any of that stuff because it does still have, natural sugars. And, but yeah, again, I'm 35 minutes from the Napa Valley. So I love a good glass of wine. But I don't, none of the sugary like cocktails or mixers or anything like that. But yeah, I think on occasion, I mean, maybe I don't even do a drink a week. I would say maybe a couple times a month I have a glass of something, but I'm not too strict on that.
Yeah. I think like in so far as alcohol has this ability to reduce stress for people,
Yeah.
That's
right,
like a non-trivial benefit of drinking alcohol, even though alcohol itself is a toxin, right? It's like,
right.
We live these stressed out lifestyles, like 2020 was a stressful year. And and I'm not being I don't think alcohol needs me to come out in its defense, but when you have an autoimmune condition and stress can, lead to flare-ups, it's like, it's nice to know that you can have like a glass of wine at the end of the day.
Right. And actually, yeah, I mean, I was going to say, I'm sure it's somewhat controversial. I do some CBD, which I think helps with stress as well. And that might be a little safer than alcohol. But yeah, I have not noticed it. I mean, I definitely hear from people with ulcerative colitis and Crohn's that alcohol or wine can really bother their systems. But when I switched to like quality wine that I knew was grown and harvested and produced in a way that wouldn't affect me, I've actually noticed a pretty significant difference. So, but again, like I can't do too much. I mean, I need to, it's within moderation for me. But yes, 2020, a glass of wine at the end of the day with 3 kids at home and trying to run a business, it's definitely been a stress reliever. That's for sure.
That's awesome. When it comes to baking, what are some of your favorite, things to make, ingredients to use? I dabble in baking,
Yeah.
I wouldn't say that I'm a pro by any means, but I've got some like recipes that I've gotten pretty good at, over time. So like, what are some of your go-tos?
It depends. I used to use a ton of almond flour, which I still use here and there, but I've noticed so many people have nut allergies. I've actually noticed that if I go overboard on like the nut flours too, that I can kind of backtrack a little bit. I use coconut flour. I like arrowroot starch or arrowroot powder here and there just to kind of give something like a more kind of pliable texture and a little bit of a crunch. My favorite sweeteners would be raw, just like very, very light colored honey. That's my favorite. I think I love the flavor of honey, but you don't want to overpower it. Maple sugar, pure maple sugar has been one of my favorite kind of new finds in the last couple years. Like there are just certain things you can't get without a granulated sugar in terms of texture. And so I've loved using that. Coconut sugar, it's been great to use and that's been around for so long, but it's very dark. It's like more like brown sugar. So maple sugar has been one of my favorite things to be able to recreate like sprinkles for my kids. Like I couldn't do that before that. Or French macarons. Like there's just certain things that you can't get. But I'm trying to think what else. I do. I love to use nut butters just because they're already super smooth and you don't get that kind of like gritty, grainy texture that you can get with some of the flours. So I use that a lot, like almond butter or sunflower seed butter in muffins or in breads, things like that. I think that's kind of it. I'm like, those are like the main things in my pantry.
I like it. Well, have you not dabbled with like some of these like sugar-free, you know, calorie-free sugar alternatives, like erythritol, monk fruit, stevia? What are your thoughts on those?
So 100% stevia I think is fine. I'm not a huge fan of the sugar alcohols. My body doesn't tend to like them. I also just don't like the flavor. I feel like they have such an interesting aftertaste. So I don't use them much. Stevia occasionally, but I kind of prefer like the regular like honey, maple syrup, those types of things. And dates. I use a lot of dates. That's another sweetener that I use.
That's cool. Yeah, I don't know. I like, I'll use erythritol, doesn't upset my stomach at all. But I know that some sugar alcohols have a very pronounced, you know, GI like distress effect.
Yeah.
But
it might be why for me, I'm like,
yeah. Interesting.
Again, I'm like, everybody's different.
Everybody's different. I don't know if you know this. This is something that I thought was very interesting. Prunes are very high in, I believe it's sorbitol, which is a sugar alcohol.
Interesting. Yeah. I had no idea.
Yeah, which is why prunes are such a well-known, they have this like well-known laxative effect.
Right.
It's not because of the fiber in the prunes. It's because of that sugar alcohol. So if you look at, and what's funny is that you'll look at like, you know, if you go to Trader Joe's or whatever, you can find these like sugar-free chocolate bars or whatever. They're loaded with sorbitol.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And so it's
funny. My husband will probably be so mad at me for saying this, but I had never heard the word sorbitol until he told me that it bothered his stomach. He doesn't have any autoimmune disease, nothing, but he used to chew gum that had sorbitol in it, and he would notice like he would get very gassy. So, and that's when I first realized, I was like, oh, I wonder if, you know, some of these other ones might be causing that with me. So, I mean, you know, it's all about like trying to listen to your body and hear the different things. But I think I'm open to some of them. I think the biggest problem for me, I get a lot of fans asking like, can I substitute in stevia? Can I substitute in monk fruit? And the problem is a lot of the brands that are out there have so many extra things in them. I'm like, it's pretty difficult you have to really seek out and look at the ingredients to find like a pure monk fruit sweetener that doesn't have a bunch of other stuff in it. And same for the stevia. But I mean, I occasionally have this like powdered 100% stevia that's just like the ground leaves that I think works really well. That's probably my favorite alternative if I were to use it.
My mom also had these memory problems that she had developed, and she was prescribed a drug for Alzheimer's disease. So I think the fact that regardless of the type of dementia a person develops, they give you these biochemical band-aids. The fact that it seemed so non-specific to me made me just intuitively think, you know, I had a theory that there had to be a better way. And having a lifelong passion for nutrition and health, just in, you know, in the sense of general fitness, my hunch was that diet and lifestyle may have had something to do with this.
Did you start pushing back on the doctors and saying that to them when they're prescribing the drugs?
Not at first, certainly, because, you know, in those moments of fear, you want to do anything that you can do to help your mom. And I think that we all tend to really put a lot of faith in the medical establishment. I don't know a single doctor that would give me their email address so I could follow up with them. You know, when something like your health is on the line, or the health of a loved one is on the line, I didn't want to wait 3 months to get another appointment to ask my follow-up questions. I just think that it's so important to become an expert in your own health. And, you know, my mom's generation, previous generations, only the doctor could know about health. Only the nutritionist could know about nutrition. We're of a generation, millennials, you know, that we want answers. You know, we feel empowered, we feel entitled to them.
So if somebody right now just walked into that, either they're being diagnosed with something that they find terrifying or someone they love is, give me like just a couple steps. So is going to pubmed.com, is that step number one? Like what are a few things that people can do to really begin that process?
That's a good question. So yes, I do think that I think using PubMed as a resource is very powerful. I think, you know, you can, a lot of studies are available for free in open access journals. But I've actually written what I call a citizen scientist handbook, because I think it's really important to know how to interpret research. I think knowing how to interpret research is, you know, science literacy is as important as financial literacy. There's a lack of both, I think, among younger people today, and that's problematic.
All right, so as you start diving in,
Yeah.
you're figuring this out, you're going after this stuff, you're building the science literacy if you didn't already have it, you're
Yeah.
reading the studies. What do you begin to learn that you think is like revolutionary knowledge?
Well, I used to think that dementia was an old person's disease, right? I like many people, didn't care about it. Alzheimer's disease was something that I thought was decades into the future, something only old people get, a natural part of aging. You know, age-related senility was something that was considered a par for the course of just getting older. But what I learned is that Alzheimer's disease begins in the brain 30 to 40 years, if not longer, before the first symptom.
Whoa.
Yeah. There are biomarkers evident on brain scans now with, you know, the hyper advanced scanning technology that we now have access to that have shown signs related to Alzheimer's disease evident in the brains of 20-year-olds. So,
Whoa.
yeah. So, I mean, this is something that might be a lifelong cascade by the time you...
Is this something I could get checked for right now?
Well, there are genetic risk factors for developing Alzheimer's disease. So the most well-defined of them is the ApoE4 allele, which is a variant of the ApoE gene that you inherit one copy from your mom, one copy from your dad.
But your thesis, if I have it right, is basically, okay, you may have the allele, the gene, but that doesn't mean that it's inevitable.
100%.
What could I do to my brain to see if I have any of the precursors of Alzheimer's?
Well, one of the top things that you can do is make sure that you are insulin sensitive, because peripheral insulin resistance, which is insulin resistance is the hallmark of type 2 diabetes, pre-diabetes. It can precede actually the appearance of chronically elevated blood sugar. And so it's been shown that that is actually very closely related to your brain's ability to create energy. So this is actually one of the defining features of Alzheimer's disease, and it might be one of the earliest things to go awry in the brain, metabolic dysfunction in the brain. And it seems to be very closely tied to the body's metabolism.
So I would go to the doctor and have them run what test?
Your fasting blood sugar and your fasting glucose, very important. And with those two biomarkers that any physician can check, they can determine your level of insulin sensitivity.
Okay. One thing you've talked a lot about in the book and in your talks, and I love this, is so I hear Alzheimer's, I think I know all about this, amyloid plaques, man, that's the problem. I just recently had my cholesterol taken. I like to think I am healthy. And my doctor literally wanted to put me on a statin.
Yeah.
And I was like, whoa, 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 whoa. I know enough to be dangerous when it comes to cholesterol. Walk us through the relationship that you've talked about that exists between potentially what amyloid plaques are and potentially what cholesterol really is. I find this really interesting.
So Alzheimer's disease was first named in 1906 by a German physician named Alois Alzheimer, but 90% of what we know about the disease has been discovered only in the past 15 years. The only way, up until very recently, that it could be diagnosed with black and white certainty was on death. They would open up the brain of a cadaver and they would examine the brain. They would notice dramatic brain shrinkage, and they would notice hallmark plaques and tangles in the brains of these patients. The plaques were an aggregation of misfolded proteins. The protein is called amyloid beta. And so the amyloid hypothesis that these plaques build up in the brain of a person with Alzheimer's disease has been the guiding path. What it now turns out, thanks to advanced scanning technology, that amyloid might actually be there at the scene of the crime, but in fact, at least initially, an innocent bystander. Because we now have scanning technology that allows us to see things that are happening in the brain well before the presentation of symptoms that might actually be more initial factors in the cascade that will ultimately create Alzheimer's disease. It's led researchers and scientists to take a step back and ask, what is causing our brains to become landfills for this amyloid plaque? And so, as I mentioned earlier, one of the burgeoning theories that now seems to be displacing, at least from my perspective, this amyloid hypothesis, because drug trials that have sought to cure the disease have a 99.6% fail rate. Oof. Yeah. So the question is, what starts first? You know, is there something that we can measure in the body or brain that begins before this buildup of amyloid plaque that we can intervene and say, you know, by taking these steps, you might prevent this disease from happening? Well, one of the, if not the earliest measurable thing to happen in the brain is a reduced ability by the brain to create ATP out of glucose. So the brain has a few fuel substrates that it can use to create ATP, which is the energetic currency of the cell. And energy for the brain is really important. In fact, 25% of your metabolic rate is used to satiate the energy requirements of the brain. So 20, you know, every 1 out of every 4 breaths that you take, a fourth of all the calories you eat is being used by your brain to create energy. So any sort of outage in the brain in terms of its ability to create energy is going to create problems. Just as an anecdote, you know, a newborn human, their brains require 90% of their base metabolic rate.
Whoa!
Yeah. So that a newborn human baby, 90% of its oxygen, all the calories that it's using is going to help its brain develop. Because actually human babies are born half-baked. We continue our development actually in the real world. This is one of the reasons why humans are so smart and we've been able to build what we've been able to build, because we complete our cognitive development in the presence of you know, other people. It's called the 4th trimester, right? That's one of the reasons why a newborn human baby is so fat, because the fat that a newborn baby comes packaged with is actually an energy reservoir for the developing brain.
I've heard you call it a Mophie.
It's a Mophie
for your brain. I love that.
It's a Mophie for the brain. It's been shown that the brain's ability to use glucose is diminished by about 50% in the brains of patients with Alzheimer's disease. So there's this really stark metabolic problem that's occurring in the brain. And thanks to functional MRI scans and PET scans, we've been able to see that there's a deficit, an energetic deficit in the brain that's evident from very early in life. And it's related to this gene that seems to put people at higher risk for the disease in the Western sort of environment, food environment.
So you see that deficit in people that have that allele,
yeah,
not necessarily across the board.
There's about a 10% reduction in the brain's ability to generate ATP out of glucose from very early on.
And you've interviewed the woman that coined the phrase diabetes type 3, which is what Alzheimer's is often referred to as. I want to walk through this process because oftentimes people talk about it at a really high level, and I want to drill down. So why is it called, we'll start with, why is it called diabetes type 3?
Well, if you have type 2 diabetes, which 50% of the US population is now either diabetic or pre-diabetic, your cells have an inability to respond to insulin, which is the hormone that allows glucose entry into those cells, where the cells
to be used as fuel?
To be used as fuel, yeah. So basically you have, despite an abundance of fuel in circulation, because blood sugar, you know, is chronically high in a person with type 2 diabetes, your cells essentially starve because they have an inability to respond to insulin, and therefore glucose has a much more difficult time getting into the cell, where it can be used to create ATP, which again is the energetic currency of cells. So in the brain, a researcher out of Brown University, who I've interviewed, Suzanne de la Monte, has coined the term type 3 diabetes to describe Alzheimer's disease, because there's a similar inability of the brain to create energy, even though, and oftentimes this is the case, there's an abundance of fuel in the body. You know, in people that are overweight, you know, people that are carrying fat around their midsections, your average pound of fat has about 3,000 backup calories that the brain will happily use for fuel, but the brain is unable to because most people on the Western, you know, diet plan are eating about 300 grams of carbohydrates per day. Carbohydrates cause insulin to become chronically elevated, and insulin acts like a one-way valve on your fat cells. So fat is, we're really good at storing fat, but in an overweight person in the modern food environment, that the ability of fat to be burned is basically blocked. Sugar is one of those things that, like oxygen, oxygen oxidizes things. It ages you. You slice an apple, leave it, there on the counter, you'll notice it start to turn brown. The same way that we need oxygen, it also is what's killing us. And the same thing goes for sugar. We need a certain amount of sugar. I mean, the brain still has about a 40% energy requirement for glucose. But sugar is also very damaging. It's glycotoxic, you know, I mean, it damages your proteins. This is one of the reasons why type 2 diabetes is so damaging. Because at that point, your blood sugar has become chronically elevated, glycating all of the proteins that make you you. I mean, we tend to think about protein as a nutrient in terms of its ability to help us grow bigger muscles, but we are made of protein. Actually, the protein that aggregates and forms the plaques that characterize Alzheimer's disease, that's another protein that can become glycated. And when this happens, when it gets bound to sugar, in the molecular sense, it becomes less easily able to be flushed away, which is something that our brains actually do when we sleep. Our brains actually clean themselves of these proteins that can aggregate over the course of the day.
So one of our best performing episodes of Health Theory ever was on sleep, which I was totally surprised by. I did not think people really cared that much about sleep, nor did I honestly know how detailed and important sleep is. Why is it that you think sleep is important?
It's so important. I mean, there's a newly discovered system in our brains called the glymphatic system, which when we're sleeping actually swooshes cerebrospinal fluid all throughout, essentially cleansing it of these proteins that aggregate over the course of the day. They've shown that on one night of bad sleep, there's an increased level of amyloid, measurable in CSF, cerebrospinal fluid. But then also, you know, I think dietary change for most people is one of the most difficult things to do. And it's particularly difficult when we have our hormones working against us. So sleep, I think, is so profoundly important because it acts like a master regulator of our hormones. It helps to, you know, make sure that we don't need to use our willpower very often because, you know, willpower is sort of like this muscle that we need to use in order to fight off cravings and things like that. But with good sleep, our cravings diminish. I mean, they've shown that even on one night of poor sleep, you consume an excess of calories the following day, anywhere between 300 and 500 calories. I've actually noticed, it's a little off topic, but one of the major breakups I had in my life, I noticed that I would feel way more sensitive to it when I was underslept. You know, you become less able to contextualize emotions when you're underslept. On just one night of bad sleep, a metabolically healthy person will be essentially pre-diabetic the next day, temporarily.
Wow.
Yeah, you become more insulin resistant. So, yeah, sleep I think is one of those things that today we romanticize being busy, but it's sort of like the one thing that lifts all the boats in your harbor, you know, and yet we tend to undervalue it.
You talked on your Instagram about you want to live for a really long time or extend your life. I forget exactly how you worded it, which got my attention. And then you said prioritize de-stressing.
Yeah.
Is that tied to sleep? Like what do you mean by that?
Well, stress is an indiscriminate killer. And today, you know, so many of us are losing sleep due to stress. It's one of the reasons why 1 in 6 adults now is on some kind of psychiatric drug.
1 in 6?
Yeah. Is on or has used.
Whoa.
We're definitely self-medicating. And it's not good. I mean, chronic stress is a major problem.
Wow.
Yeah.
So give me some tactics. How does one de-stress?
You know, I think meditation is really important. You know, I'm one of those people that I was trained to meditate. I think this is really important. I think, you know, being taught how to meditate is as important as being taught how to do yoga. You know, we don't come out of the womb knowing how to do a downward dog and to hit, you know, any of the number of yoga poses that we're taught to do with a good yoga teacher. Having a good meditation teacher is very, I think, is critical to knowing how to de-stress. I also think, you know, knowing what chronic stress is and knowing what it isn't is really important, you know. So in my book, I differentiate between chronic stress and acute stress, which acute stress is very beneficial. It's, you know, what we do in the gym. We stress our bodies. Chronic psychological stress is really toxic. It's working under a boss that you hate. It's being stuck in a relationship that's gone sour. By de-stressing and by, you know, doing physical exercise and things like that, you actually increase your resilience to stress. Cortisol sort of gets a bad rap because it's related to stress, but it's actually a really important hormone. It's the body's chief waking hormone. So for about 45 minutes after you wake up, cortisol is the highest that it's really meant to be throughout the day. It's part of the body's natural circadian hormonal ebb and flow. And in that window, for about 45 minutes after you wake up, that's a great fat burning window. You've got that cortisol spike, which is really working to liberate stored fats, stored sugars, for use by your body as fuel. It's meant as a way of, allowing fuels to become accessible so that you can use them and carpe diem, right? Seize the day. Within that window, it's particularly dangerous to consume breakfast in its most standard American form, which is usually rapidly digesting carbohydrates from oatmeal, granola bars, things like that, because that causes a spike in insulin. But going back to stress, this is why consuming carbs in the context of chronic stress is so bad, because you've got cortisol chronically elevated due to chronic stress, and then we're continuing to keep our insulin elevated with the carbohydrates that we're consuming. So this not only helps redistribute our weight from muscle to fat, but also our visceral fat, which is the most inflammatory kind of fat that wraps around our internal organs, actually has about 4 times the cortisol receptors on it. So this is actually why when you look at people that are chronically stressed out, their bodies take on a very particular shape. It's totally different from run-of-the-mill obesity, where people are just eating lots and lots of calories and not necessarily chronically stressed out. Somebody who's chronically stressed and eating lots of carbs in particular, they usually have skinny arms and skinny legs, but a bulging midsection, because their visceral fat is just soaking up all the excess carbs that they're eating because of the presence of chronically elevated cortisol.
That's so weird.
It's super
fascinating. I had
fascinating.
no idea. I always thought that was just like, oh, some people, that's how they put on fat. I like to think of stress as, it's sort of invisible and it doesn't really have any lingering effects. But when you see that it can play out into an actual body type, that's when it gets really crazy.
Yeah.
Now, one type of stress you've talked about that is really useful, and I go a little bit deeper, thermal stress. I'd never heard of that before. What is it exactly, and how do we leverage it?
So, our bodies were, we're the ultimate performance machines, right? We all evolved chasing our food, and really being honed to perform physical bouts of exercise. But thermal exercise is another form of exercise that we also had for the vast majority of our evolution. And I think chronic climate control, something that we've developed, with air conditioning and heat and things like that, really has been to the detriment in many ways of our health. So we can look at research that was performed recently out of Finland that I think is very compelling. They found that people who used saunas 4 to 7 times per week had a dramatic risk reduction for Alzheimer's disease. About 65% risk reduction for people that use sauna 4 to 7 times per week. Really, I mean, there's no drug on the market that'll cut your risk of developing Alzheimer's disease by 65%. Finland is the sauna capital of the world. So in Finland, there's on average 1 sauna per household in Finland. It's like taking a shower in Finland. It's so embedded into the culture. In fact, there's a great documentary called Steam of Life, which documents all of the weird ways in which people in Finland will, create like phone booths, abandoned phone booths into saunas. Things like that. It's very strange, yeah. So they found that in this population, that saunas really seem to play a protective role in terms of vascular function. It also was related to a dramatic risk reduction for high blood pressure, but then also for dementia. It seems to really help promote what's called vascular compliance and reduce high blood pressure. So what coincides with Alzheimer's disease is also vascular dysfunction. Of all of the microcapillaries that provide, blood, fuel, nutrients to the brain. And so anything that's good for the heart is going to be good for the brain, and saunas seem to really be good for the heart as well.
What about like cold showers and stuff?
Yeah, those are all great. They are really good in terms of really dialing mental acuity. I mean, you can feel it instantly. You take a cold shower. There was a really great study performed where people with type 2 diabetes were told to basically turn the air conditioning down on low to about, I believe it was 60 or 66 degrees Fahrenheit for 6 hours a day. So, I mean, that's not freezing. It's cold, but it's not freezing. And there was about a 25% increase in their insulin sensitivity. Not changing their diet at all or doing any additional physical exercise, just exposing themselves to colder temperatures. They showed a dramatic increase in their metabolic health. again, insulin resistance is the hallmark of type 2 diabetes.
I'm so surprised by that.
Yeah. Cold stress, heat stress, all very beneficial. So I try to compel people to get out of their comfort zones in the thermal sense. You know, it's really good for creativity, getting out of your comfort zone, but it seems to be the case as well in terms of temperature.
That is really interesting, and I hate you for it because I hate being cold so much
So
I
do
can't
I.
begin to tell you.
Yeah, so do I actually, but you know, I think it's one of those things that seems to be really beneficial. You know, I go to my mom's house occasionally, and the heat is always blasting. It's like always like super warm in that apartment. Not like sauna level temperature, but just
Right.
always, you know, my mom doesn't like to be cold. She doesn't like to be hot. She likes to live only within that narrow range of her comfort.
Glad you brought your mom back up. I wanted to talk a little bit more about something you said that I thought was so beautiful. So I grew up in a morbidly obese family, and I really struggle with,
Wow.
I know what they need to do, but that's very stressful for them emotionally, and I don't want to stress that relationship out. And you said something similar about your mom, and you said, I don't ever want her food choice to damage the relationship that I have with her.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that? What advice do you have for caregivers, loved ones of somebody that's going through dementia?
It sounds cliche to say, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. So I think at a certain point, you should teach. You know, I think that's one of our missions here on earth as empathetic and compassionate beings, is to lead your neighbor, lead your loved one to a greater vision of life. You know, that's what you're doing with the show. I think you can't do it with force. You can't do it with aggression. You've got to be, I think, a bit more gentle. And when it comes to loved ones, and especially people that are suffering with chronic diseases and that, you know, you don't know what they're going through psychologically, I think it's really important to provide the information, but then to step back and detach at a certain point. At a certain point with my mom, I would get very emotionally wound up in what my mom was eating, and I would become upset if I went to her house and I saw that she had an open bag of chips or, you know, cookies or whatever, you know, whatever. And I didn't want that to interfere with the time that I was spending with my mom. You know, I would never want to do that. And I value so much the time that I spend with my mom. And I know that I'm really neurotic when it comes to nutrition and health, but I don't judge other people.
In your book, you do a great job of not spending a lot of time demonizing anything, but instead really being quite prescriptive about, okay, if you want to upgrade yourself, which is like the big tag in your website, which I absolutely love. So if somebody wants to upgrade themselves, knowing that every word that's about to come out of your mouth comes with compassion, and knowing that there's a lot of individual variability, and
Yes.
you get all of that, but like in a nutshell, for somebody that wants to upgrade themselves, what should they eat and not eat?
Yeah. So, you know, opt for foods that are nutrient dense. One of the easiest things that I recommend that people can do every single day is to consume what I call a large fatty salad. I think it's one of the best ways to really check off so many of your nutritional boxes, to get an abundance of dietary fiber that the microbes that live in your large intestine love to consume. And when I say fatty, I don't mean, you know, throwing on tortilla strips and cheese and ranch dressing. I mean, you know, taking a bowl of dark leafy greens, kale, spinach, which are, you know, top sources of magnesium, which 50% of people do not consume adequate amounts of, folate, arugula. Arugula is a top source of nitrates, dietary nitrate, really important in terms of increasing blood flow to the brain. One single high nitrate meal might actually improve cognitive function. It's that powerful. Dousing those dark leafy greens with extra virgin olive oil, which research has shown out of Barcelona, Spain, the PREDIMED study, you can consume about a liter a week to better cognitive function, cognitive health, cardiovascular health, and it might even help you lose weight because it's so anti-inflammatory. Actually, there's a compound in extra virgin olive oil that is as anti-inflammatory as low-dose Advil, but without any of the potential for negative side effects. And importantly, you need to have fat in that salad because fat allows many of the most important nutrients in the salad to become bioavailable. So I talk a lot about in this book, which I think is bringing, you know, especially, you know, there's a lot, I think actually that there's a lot of new information that I bring to the conversation, but I talk particularly about carotenoids, and how research has shown out of University of Georgia that by eating lutein and zeaxanthin, by supplementing with these carotenoids, you can actually boost visual processing speed by 20%, even if you're young and healthy. So I mean, these are young and healthy people that are already considered to be at the peak of their cognitive prowess. Visual processing speed is so important. I mean, think about it in terms of responding to visual stimuli, you know, driving, athletic performance, sports performance, things like that.
Video games.
Video games. Yeah, absolutely. So dark leafy greens are abundant in these two carotenoids, and they're only absorbed through the digestive tract when in the presence of fat. You don't absorb any of them unless you're consuming them with fat. So like that fat-free dressing, throw that in the trash. Extra virgin olive oil, you know, is super key. Eating a large fatty salad, I think, is just really key. People tend to think about salads in terms of like weight loss. I want to lose weight, I'm going to eat more salad. But really in terms of the brain, it's powerful. You also get the benefit of, I mentioned dietary fiber. We now know that you have microbes that live in your large intestine that when you consume fermentable, soluble prebiotic fiber, which is found in abundance in that bowl of greens, the microbes churn out a compound called butyrate, which is profoundly anti-inflammatory. It is really, you know, beneficial in terms of the gut ecosystem. It's been shown to boost levels of growth factors in the brain, which promote neuroplasticity, which is your brain's ability to change over time. Very important stuff. In terms of lifestyle, you know, I advise, as I mentioned, not eating for an hour or two after you wake up. People today are really obsessed with intermittent fasting, which I think is, you know, really great. At the very least, it I think has awakened people to the necessity to bring back balance in terms of being fed and being fasted. But I don't get hung up over the hours. I think it's just really important to honor the body's natural circadian inclinations. You really want to, like, after that 1, 2, or 3 hour window, eat your food and then stop eating for 2 to 3 hours before bed. Again, you know, we talked about the glymphatic system. It's a newly discovered system, but, you know, it's been theorized that eating soon before bed might interfere with that cleanup process. And then, you know, I try to eat a low-carb diet. I try to avoid dense sources of carbohydrate, with the exception of occasionally eating them in the post-workout window. If you're going to eat carbs throughout the day, you really want to concentrate them into one meal. It seems that when you consume your carbs concentrated into one meal, less insulin is required to clear those carbs from circulation, that glucose from circulation, as opposed to if you were to spread them out over the course of the day, which makes that old advice to eat 6 small meals throughout the day particularly bad, because insulin seems to be able to compound on itself. So rather than eating, you know, 30 grams of carbs at lunch, 30 grams of carbs at dinner, 30 grams of carbs at breakfast, concentrate them into one meal, and there's less of an, you know, insulin AUC. So less insulin being stimulated to clear that glucose, which is important because, as we talked about earlier, glucose is very damaging when it's in the blood. It glycates those proteins.
That is really interesting. Everything you've said is really interesting.
I mean, yeah, Hey, if you like that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.
Aside from paleo, or occasionally I kind of revert to like an autoimmune protocol when I'm not feeling well, which cuts out the nuts, the seeds, the nightshades. So that definitely is a little bit more extreme. But I found that I don't have to do that all the time, which I'm grateful for. It's really just in order to kind of get symptoms at bay. But really for me, it's grain and dairy free, no refined sugars, no legumes,